Yo, what's poppin', fam? It's Adam Cole back again. Today, we're diving into 7 absolutely unhinged Reddit stories that had me sitting here like, nah, bro, there's no way this is real life. So, first up, we got I found out my family kept a dark secret about my past and now someone wants me dead. Like, hello? That's not a story. That's a whole Netflix limited series, my guy. I'm stressed already. Then we got my sibling tried to take everything from me, so I made them regret it. Classic entitled sibling energy. Reddit never disappoints with the drama, and we're wrapping it up with I witnessed a crime that everyone tried to cover up. Bro, that title alone gave me goosebumps. I'm low key too invested already. And don't trip, we still got 4 more wild ones, so stay locked in. If you want to skip around, timestamps are down below and in the description, so go crazy. Aight, grab your snacks, get comfy, vibe out, and let's roll straight into story 1. I found out my family kept a dark secret about my past, and now someone wants me dead. I never thought a funeral could feel so quiet, like the world decided to hold its breath just to remind me I was alone in it. But that's exactly how my father's funeral felt that gray morning in Portland. The church was small, the kind that smelled like damp wood and forgotten prayers, and as the rain tapped gently against the stained glass windows, all I could think about was how my mom hadn't said a single word since he died. She just stood there, hands folded, eyes fixed on the closed casket, like she was watching a secret being buried instead of a man. My father, Richard Cole, was the kind of man people described as steady. He worked for the city's planning department, fixed things around the house on weekends, and drank his beer quietly while watching the evening news. We weren't close, not in the movie kind of way. We didn't hug much or talk about feelings, but I always thought that was normal. That's just how dads were, right? Still, standing there in that dim church with my mom's silence pressing down on me like a weight, I couldn't help but feel something was off. Not grief exactly, but a strange kind of hollowness, like there was something I was supposed to remember but couldn't. After the funeral, I drove my mom home. The silence between us thick enough to chew on. The house felt different too, emptier somehow. My dad's smell lingered. Aftershave and old books, but there was something else beneath it. Something metallic. Like dust from an attic that hadn't been opened in years. My mom went straight to her room and shut the door. No tears, no small talk, nothing. I figured cleaning up my dad's study might help me feel like I was doing something useful. Or maybe I just wanted a reason not to sit alone with the weird ache in my chest. His study was always off limits when I was a kid, like a sacred space. He had these old oak bookshelves filled with dusty law books and city maps, and a big mahogany desk that always seemed way too fancy for a government employee. I started sorting through his papers, bills, letters, a few old receipts, normal stuff. But then I noticed something strange. The bottom drawer on the left side of his desk didn't slide all the way in. I pulled it out, curious, and there it was. A small gap at the back, like the wood panel didn't belong. I tapped it lightly, and it sounded hollow. I don't know why my pulse spiked, but it did. Maybe it was the quietness of the house, or maybe it was the feeling that I wasn't supposed to find whatever was behind that panel. I used a screwdriver from his tool drawer and gently pried it open. Behind it, wedged deep inside the frame, was a small wooden box, old, heavy, and locked. The kind of box you'd see in old movies where people keep love letters or war medals. There was no key anywhere that I could see. I stared at it for a minute, turning it over in my hands, and the strangest thing hit me. I'd seen that box before. Not in this house, but somewhere else. A flash of memory, blurry and warm. A woman laughing, sunlight through a kitchen window, a voice calling my name. But not my mom's voice. I shook it off, blaming stress and lack of sleep. I carried the box to the workbench in the garage and, after a few minutes of trying to be delicate, gave up and used a hammer and chisel to break the lock. The lid creaked open with a sound that made my stomach twist, like I was waking something that had been asleep too long. Inside, there were 3 things. A folded piece of paper, a photograph, and a small plastic bag with something that looked like a birth certificate. My name was there, Ryan, but the last name wasn't Cole. It said Ethan Parker. I blinked, thinking maybe it was some kind of clerical error, or maybe my dad had kept someone else's papers. But the date of birth matched mine exactly. I unfolded the newspaper clipping next. The edges yellowed and soft from age. The headline read, "Toddler missing after house fire, parents presumed dead." My throat went dry as I scanned the article. A family named Parker had died in a fire in Northern California 23 years ago. The bodies of the parents were recovered, but their 2-year-old son, Ethan, was never found. There was a grainy black and white photo of the boy, and even though it was old and blurry, I knew that face. It was me. My head started spinning. I looked at the photo next, the one in the box. It showed a couple standing in front of a white house with a child between them. The woman was holding the kid's hand and the man had his arm around her shoulders. Someone had written on the back, "The Parkers, Summer 02." My hand started trembling. My parents? No. The people who raised me had never mentioned anything about me being adopted, let alone kidnapped. I stumbled back into the study, clutching the box like it might explain itself if I stared at it long enough. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I went to my mom's door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Mom, silence. I opened the door slightly. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding one of my dad's sweaters, staring at nothing. Mom, I said quietly, my voice shaking. What is this? I held out the box, the papers trembling in my hand. Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide and terrified in a way I'd never seen before. Where did you find that? She whispered. In Dad's study, I said. What's going on? Who are the Parkers? Her face went pale. She stood up, walked over to me, and grabbed the papers out of my hand. You shouldn't have opened it, she said, her voice trembling. Mom, what the hell are you talking about? I demanded. That's me in that picture. Why does this birth certificate have a different name? Why is there a missing child article with my photo? Her hands were shaking so bad she dropped the box. You don't understand, she whispered. We were trying to protect you. Protect me from what? I asked, my voice rising. She looked at me then, really looked at me, like she was seeing a ghost. Don't open that door, Ryan. Please. Some things you can't come back from once you know. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but something in her tone, something desperate, made me freeze. She sank back down onto the bed, her shoulders trembling. Please, she said again, barely above a whisper. Just leave it alone. But how the hell was I supposed to leave something like that alone? My mind was racing, connecting dots that didn't make sense. If my parents weren't really my parents, then who was I? Who were the Parkers? And why would they hide something like this for 23 years? I walked out of her room before I said something I'd regret. My hands were sweating, my thoughts tangled in a dozen directions. I sat down at the kitchen table with the photo and flipped it over again. On the back, under the Parkers, there was a phone number written in faded blue ink. I hesitated. It was probably disconnected. I told myself it had to be, right? But something deep inside me, curiosity, dread, maybe both, pushed me to pick up my phone and dial it anyway. It rang once, twice, and then there was a click. A woman's voice, soft and shaky, answered. Hello? For a second, I couldn't say anything. My throat felt like it had closed up. Hi, I managed. I found this old photo and your number was on it. I think it might be a mistake, but do you know the Parkers? There was a long pause. I could hear breathing on the other end, fast and uneven. Then, in a voice that cracked like she'd seen a ghost, the woman whispered, Oh my God, Ryan, you're alive? I didn't sleep that night after hearing that voice on the phone. The way she said my name, Ryan, but not like my mom ever said it. Not like someone reading it off a page, but like she'd been saying it her whole life. Like she owned it, like it belonged to her more than it did to me. I kept replaying it over and over while sitting at my kitchen table, staring at that old photo under the dim light, the one with the Parkers scribbled on the back. When I finally spoke again, my voice came out shaky, almost foreign. Who are you? I asked. There was silence for a moment, then the woman said, My name is Evelyn Parker. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything, but she must have heard the tremor in my breath because she added softly, You were my son, Ethan. You disappeared after the fire. I froze. My heart started hammering so hard I could barely breathe. You must have the wrong person, I said, forcing a weak laugh, but it sounded hollow even to me. No, she said firmly. I would know your voice anywhere. I would know those eyes. I glanced at the photo again. Her eyes, the woman in it, were green like mine. The same shade, the same shape. It felt like my brain was trying to reject what my eyes already believed. She asked me if I could meet her, said she had proof, said she needed to see me in person to explain. Against all reason, I said yes. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to prove she was crazy. But a small buried part of me, the part that had been whispering that something about my life never quite fit, wanted it to be true. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in downtown Portland the next day. I barely remember driving there. It was like I was watching myself from the outside, a puppet being pulled by something bigger than me. When I walked in, I saw her immediately. She was sitting by the window, wearing a faded blue sweater and holding a cup of tea like she'd been waiting for years instead of minutes. When she looked up, her face broke into this trembling, heartbreaking smile. Ethan, she whispered, standing up slowly. I didn't move. I didn't know how to. Her eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer, stopping just in front of me. Up close, I could see the lines around her eyes, the kind you get from smiling too much once and crying too much later. You look just like your father, she said. Same jawline, same expression, when you're confused. I should have walked away. I should have told her she had the wrong guy, but when she reached into her purse and pulled out a photo album, my breath caught. Inside were baby pictures. Me, or at least a kid who could have been me, sitting in a tiny inflatable pool, holding a stuffed bear I swear I remembered losing when I was little. This was your favorite toy, she said, pointing to the bear. You wouldn't sleep without it. You called him Mr. Finn. The name hit me like a punch. Mr. Finn. I hadn't thought about that in decades, but I remembered crying for hours when I lost it. My mom had told me we'd thrown it away because it was too old and dirty. Evelyn's hands shook as she turned another page, me with a birthday cake, 3 candles, frosting on my nose, her arm wrapped around me. Everything in me wanted to reject it, to say it was impossible, but it wasn't. The resemblance was too strong. too specific. She told me about the night of the fire, how it started in the kitchen, how she'd managed to get out but couldn't find me in the smoke, how her husband, my supposed father, had run back in to find me but never came out. They told me both of you were gone, she whispered. For years I believed it, until they told me your body was never found. I never stopped looking, I never stopped hoping. I sat there speechless, the coffee in my hand gone cold. I don't understand, I said finally. How would I end up here? Why would my parents take me? She looked down at the table, tears slipping down her cheeks. Maybe they didn't know, she said softly. Or maybe they did. I don't know what story they told you, but I swear to you, Ethan, you're my son. I felt like I was standing on the edge of two realities and both were cracking at once. I told her I needed time, that I had to talk to my mom. When I got home, my mom was in the kitchen, staring out the window. You met her, didn't you? She said before I could speak. I froze. So it's true? I asked. Her name's Evelyn Parker. She says I'm her son. My mom turned, her face tight, her eyes red but dry. We saved you, she said quietly. From what? I asked. From a bad situation, she said, her voice trembling. You don't know what they were involved in. You were in danger. Your father, your adoptive father, he did what he had to do to keep you safe. I felt my stomach twist. What does that even mean? You took me? You kidnapped me? No, she shouted, her voice cracking. We rescued you. We couldn't have kids, and when we found you, you were in the system. No one was looking for you. They told us you'd been abandoned. We did everything we could to make it legal, but something went wrong. They lost the papers. We kept going. We loved you, Ryan. You're our son. My hands were shaking. You lied to me, I said. My whole life. She took a step toward me, desperate. We did what we had to. If you knew the things your father saw, the people involved, it wasn't safe. Please, Ryan, let it go. But I couldn't. I felt like my entire existence had been rewritten without my permission. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's face, the scar on my shoulder I'd had since childhood, and how she mentioned her son had one just like it from a fall when he was 2. I looked it up. There was an old police report archived online. Ethan Parker, age 2, missing after residential fire, identifying mark, crescent-shaped scar on right shoulder. I stared at that line for hours. There was no denying it anymore. My mom's story didn't add up. The next day, I went to the county records office. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with coffee breath, typed my info into the system and frowned. There's something odd here, she said. Your adoption records aren't finalized. It looks like they were started but never completed. You don't have a finalized adoption certificate. I felt my stomach drop. So what does that mean? I asked. It means, she said, lowering her voice, as far as the state is concerned, you're not legally adopted by anyone. You're unassigned. Unassigned. The word hit like a thunderclap. I walked out of that office in a daze, my whole identity unraveling with every step. I wasn't Ryan Cole, at least not legally. I wasn't anyone. When I got home, I confronted my mom again. You forged my documents, I said. You knew this wasn't legal. She didn't deny it. We had to, she said. You were so little, so scared. Your father said if we didn't do it, they'd take you back to those people. He said they'd hurt you. Who? I asked. What people? She shook her head, tears in her eyes. I can't, she whispered. You don't understand what's at stake. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. Instead, I just stood there, numb, watching her crumble under the weight of whatever she wasn't telling me. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by papers, birth certificates, the newspaper article, the photo, everything laid out. Like evidence in some twisted case file, my reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Who the hell was I? Ryan Cole or Ethan Parker? Or someone else entirely? I didn't have long to think. Around midnight, I heard a noise at the door, a faint click like someone trying to pick the lock. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed a kitchen knife and moved quietly toward the door. The handle turned slowly, deliberately. I flicked on the light and the sound stopped. For a second, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. I opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, but whoever it was already gone. When I looked down, I saw a folded piece of paper tucked under my doormat. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and opened it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 5 words that made my blood run cold. Some truths should stay buried. After that night with the note under my door, I stopped sleeping. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified. The creak of the pipes, the hum of the fridge, the distant shuffle of footsteps in the hall, all of it set my nerves on fire. I couldn't stop thinking about the words scrawled in that jagged handwriting. Some truths should stay buried. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. I knew I had to dig deeper, but I also knew that whoever left that note didn't want me alive long enough to find what I was looking for. I started with the only person who might know more, Evelyn. When I told her about the break-in and the note, she went pale. They found you, she whispered. Who? I asked, but she just shook her head. The ones your father tried to stop. That's when she told me about Marcus Hale, a retired detective who'd investigated my kidnapping or disappearance, as they called it 23 years ago. She said he'd quit the force not long after the case went cold. He never stopped looking, she said. If anyone can help you, it's him. I found Marcus in a rundown house outside of town, the kind of place with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, the mailbox hanging off by one nail. He was in his late 60s, gray beard, Heavy eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. When I told him my name, he stared at me for a long time before motioning for me to come in. His living room was a mess of old case files and empty coffee mugs, stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings covering every surface. "You're the Parker boy," he said quietly. I always knew there was more to that case than what they let on. He poured himself a drink, hands shaking slightly. "Your parents, the ones who raised you, they weren't just some couple who stumbled into a lost kid? I think they were part of something bigger, something ugly." He pulled out a faded file from a box labeled Parker Fire Case 2002. Inside were photos of the burned house, the newspaper article, and a list of names. One of them made my stomach twist. Richard Cole, my adoptive father. "Your father worked for the city, didn't he?" Marcus said. "Planning department?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah. How did you know?" "Because that department was one of the main channels used to move children through fake adoption programs," he said. "They called it humanitarian work, said they were helping orphaned kids from disaster areas. But it was trafficking, Ryan. They took kids from poor families, foster homes, even fire scenes like yours. They'd make the parents disappear, change the records, and sell the kids to families willing to pay." I felt like the room was closing in around me. "You're saying my parents bought me?" He shook his head. "Maybe not your mom, but your dad. He had connections to a man named Dr. Leonard Graves. That's the one name that came up over and over when we tried to dig into these fake adoptions. Graves was a criminal psychologist officially. Unofficially, he was the architect behind what we later called the Hearthstone Network." "Hearthstone?" I repeated. He nodded grimly. "A government-funded program meant tour home children after major tragedies. Earthquakes, fires, floods. It started with good intentions, but it became a cover for trafficking. They falsified identities, erased records. Your case was one of the first that went wrong." He handed me an old photo of a man with slicked back hair and cold, intelligent eyes. "That's Graves. Your biological father, Daniel Parker, was trying to expose him. He'd found evidence that Hearthstone was being used to sell children to elite families and corporate donors. 2 days before he planned to go public, his house burned down. Officially an accident. But we both know better." My head was spinning. I remembered Evelyn telling me that Daniel died trying to save me in the fire. "You're saying he was murdered?" Marcus leaned back, his eyes dark. "I'm saying he was silenced. And I think your adoptive father was part of it. Maybe not the killer, but involved." I wanted to deny it, to defend the man who raised me. But the puzzle pieces were starting to fit too perfectly. The locked box, the fake birth certificate, my mother's panic, it all pointed in one direction: guilt. Marcus handed me a flash drive. "Everything I've got is on here. Files, names, locations. If you're serious about finding the truth, this will get you started. But be careful. The people behind this aren't amateurs. They've buried a lot deeper secrets than you." I took the drive, thanked him, and left, feeling like the air outside was heavier than before. That night, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. Inside were dozens of folders, scanned reports, photos, government documents. I found one labeled Cole Graves Correspondence, my father's name. I clicked it open. There were emails between Richard Cole and Leonard Graves, dated just a year before my father died. Most were cryptic, but one stood out. "If he starts remembering," Graves wrote, "you know what to do." My blood ran cold. Who was he? Me? Remembering what? I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. I didn't know whether to feel betrayed or terrified. The next day, I went to my mom's house. The door was unlocked, which was unusual. "Mom," I called out. No answer. The house was eerily quiet. Her purse was on the counter, her keys still hanging by the door. I checked every room empty. Her phone was lying on the coffee table, screen cracked, battery dead. There was a note beside it in her handwriting. "Meeting someone who knows the truth. Don't worry, I'll be back tonight." But she didn't come back that night, or the next, or the one after that. I filed a missing person report, but the police barely took it seriously. "She's probably grieving," they said. "People disappear for a few days when they're under stress." They didn't understand my mom wouldn't just vanish, not after everything. I called Evelyn, told her what happened. She was quiet for a long moment before saying, "They're tying up loose ends, Ryan. You need to get out of there." I wanted to believe she was being paranoid, but the next morning I got an email from an unknown address. Subject line, "Stop." The message contained only one attachment, a photo of me taken the night before, sitting at my desk, the blinds half open. Someone had been watching me. I felt my chest tighten as I locked every door and window in the apartment. Then, for reasons I can't fully explain, I drove back to Marcus's place. When I got there, his door was ajar. "Marcus?" I called. No answer. I stepped inside. The place had been trashed, papers everywhere, furniture overturned, drawers ripped out. The old man was gone. I found one of his files still intact on the floor, half burned at the edges. It was labeled Project Hearthstone Sealed Cases. Inside was a page with government letterhead and a list of names. At the bottom of that list was mine: Ethan Parker, alias Ryan Cole, status recovered classified, level 5. My hands were trembling so hard I almost dropped it. The word recovered stuck in my brain like a splinter. Recovered from what, or from who? In the corner of the document was a small seal FBI. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just a trafficking network, it was a government cover-up. I drove back home, my mind racing. When I got there, my laptop screen was on. Though I turned it off before leaving, the same folder from the flash drive was open, but a new file had appeared. Do not dig. Inside was a single image, the FBI seal, and a file code. Project Hearthstone, Subject 17. And beneath it, in bold letters, DNA match confirmed. My name, my DNA, my past, it was all connected to a sealed FBI operation. I sat there in the dark, the glow from the screen washing over my face, realizing that the truth I'd been chasing wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about something much bigger, and I was already too deep to turn back. I didn't sleep for days after finding that file marked Project Hearthstone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my name printed beneath that cold government seal like I was some lab specimen instead of a person. I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't keep running in circles anymore. If this operation existed, if my entire life had been orchestrated by it, I needed to find its heart and rip it open. That's how I ended up driving through the frozen nothingness of Montana in the middle of the night, chasing coordinates I'd found buried in one of Marcus's decrypted files. The location was listed as Facility 12B, Hearthstone Archive. From the road, it looked like nothing, just a weather-beaten building half swallowed by pine trees, a chain-link fence hanging loose like no one cared to guard it anymore. I killed the engine, stepped out into the cold air, and felt that electric hum of dread again. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I'd already lost too much to stop now. Inside, the place smelled like rust and mildew. My flashlight cut through the dark, catching glimpses of overturned chairs, shattered glass, and peeling safety posters that warned about confidential containment zones. I followed a trail of paper into what looked like an old records room, file cabinets half open, some gutted, some sealed with warning labels. Most were empty, but one drawer near the back had a red tag marked Hearthstone Subjects Retained. My hand trembled as I pulled it open. Inside were manila folders thick with reports and photos. Each one had a name, a date of birth, and a stamp that said, Recovered Child. I flipped through them until I froze on one with a familiar photo of my face, maybe 5 years old, eyes wide, soot on my cheeks. The file read, Subject 17. Ethan Daniel Parker. Status, reassigned under witness reallocation protocol. Handler, Dr. L. Graves. I felt my chest tighten. Reassigned? Handler? None of it sounded like rescue. It sounded like ownership. The deeper I read, the worse it got. Hearthstone wasn't some adoption charity gone wrong. It was an organized pipeline. Children were taken from homes labeled at risk or from disasters where their parents had allegedly perished, then quietly reassigned to politically connected or financially powerful families under the guise of emergency placement. The documents listed donors, senators, judges, CEOs, and right in the middle of it all was the same signature over and over, Leonard Graves, PhD. My flashlight caught a photo tucked in the back of the folder, my adoptive father shaking hands with Graves. On the back, written in faded pen, were the words, Final delivery approved. I don't remember dropping the file, but I do remember the world going white around me for a second. My father, the man I thought had loved me, had been part of it. Marcus was right. He tried to back out later, probably realized what he'd done, and they killed him for it. That's why he died so suddenly. Why no one ever found his phone or laptop. It wasn't an accident, it was cleanup. Somewhere in the building, I heard a faint sound, a door creaking, a footstep. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening. You shouldn't be here, Ryan, a voice said. Calm and deliberate, echoing off the concrete. The flashlight clicked on across the room, revealing a gaunt old man in a long coat. White hair slicked back, eyes like knives. Dr. Leonard Graves. He didn't even look surprised to see me. You've been quite persistent, he said, stepping closer, the beam of light catching the wrinkles in his face. Marcus was right to keep you away, but curiosity is a stubborn thing. You killed him, I said, and my father, and probably my mom. He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. Killed? No, Ryan. Your father was a complication, a man with a conscience in a system that punished it. He wanted to expose us, yes, but he wasn't very careful about how. His death was regrettable. As for your mother, she made her choice. I felt the words burn through me. You're saying she was part of it too? She wasn't supposed to be, he said. But when she realized who you were, whose son you were, she became unpredictable. She tried to protect you from yourself. He stepped closer, his voice softening in a way that made my skin crawl. Do you know why you survived that fire, Ryan? Why you were saved when your parents weren't? I didn't answer. Because you weren't just kidnapped, he continued. You were chosen. Your parents, Daniel and Rachel Parker, were whistleblowers inside Hearthstone. They had documents, names, evidence that could destroy everything. When we realized they wouldn't stay quiet, we erased them. But you were valuable. You were proof of their involvement, the last trace of what they tried to expose. We couldn't kill you, so we made you disappear. My head was spinning. You made me disappear. We placed you with a compliant family, he said. Your father understood the arrangement. At first, he was supposed to raise you, keep you quiet until you were old enough to forget. But then, he grew sentimental. started digging. That's when we had to intervene. He smiled faintly. You were never meant to remember who you were. I pulled out my phone, hit record without breaking eye contact. So that's it? You took kids from families, sold them, killed anyone who talked, and called it rehoming? Graves sighed, almost bored. You make it sound so crude. We gave them lives, futures. Do you think any of those children would have survived where they came from? Foster care, war zones? We gave them purpose. I felt something inside me snap. You destroyed lives. You turned children into products. His expression hardened. Idealism is a luxury for the innocent, Ryan. You, of all people, should understand that. I took a step closer. No, what I understand is that people like you think you can play God and get away with it. He smirked. You think recording me changes anything? The world forgets. It always does. I didn't reply, just kept the phone steady, letting his words pour out like poison. I pushed further, asking about the donors, the FBI seal, Project Hearthstone's true scope. He didn't even hesitate. He told me everything, how the program started under a humanitarian initiative, how government agencies funneled funds through charities, how children were reassigned to trusted families to build loyalty networks. Every president since the 80s has known, he said, almost proudly. You can't undo this. You can't expose what doesn't officially exist. When he was done talking, I stopped recording and said, maybe not, but people still care about the truth. He frowned, realizing too late what I'd done. I backed away, keeping my phone in view. You'll be dead before it spreads, he said. Maybe, I said, but you'll be dead first. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls as I heard him shouting behind me. I didn't stop until I was in the car, shaking, gasping, hitting send. The video uploaded automatically to a dozen mirrored sites Marcus had set up for whistleblowers. By the time I hit the highway, my phone was blowing up with notifications, retweets, shares, comments. The confession was out there. The internet was erupting. Within hours, news stations were broadcasting it. Graves' name was trending worldwide. Government trafficking ring, the headlines read. Leaked confession exposes Hearthstone program. They couldn't bury it anymore. But the victory felt hollow. 2 days later, they found Graves dead, apparent suicide. Though I didn't believe that for a second. I went to my mother's grave that evening, the sky gray and still. The woman who raised me had lied to protect me. I finally understood that now. She must have known what my father did, what I was part of, and carried that secret until it killed her. I knelt beside her headstone, brushed the snow from the letters of her name, and whispered, you lied to save me, but the truth set me free. My voice cracked halfway through, but it didn't matter. I felt lighter somehow, broken, yes, but lighter. The story didn't end with justice. It never does. But it began something. Protests filled cities. Journalists dug into files that had been sealed for decades. The FBI reopened cases they'd long ignored. Project Hearthstone became a symbol of corruption, of lost innocence, of what happens when power decides who deserves a future. As for me, I disappeared again. But this time on my own terms. I left the city, changed my number, moved somewhere quiet where no one knew my name. Some nights I still wake up thinking I hear my mother's voice, or my father calling from the fire. I wonder if I'll ever feel normal again, or if people like me are meant to live in the shadows of truth. But when the wind hits just right, and I hear the faint sound of children playing in the distance, I remind myself that I wasn't erased. I survived. And maybe that's enough. The end. I built a business from scratch and outsmarted everyone who doubted me. I don't think anyone really wakes up one day expecting their life to fall apart, but that's exactly what happened to me at 27, sitting in a half-broken office chair inside the cramped marketing agency where I'd wasted 3 years of my life. My name's Ethan Cole, and at that time, I was the kind of guy who kept telling himself that next month will be better, even though every month somehow managed to get worse. The office smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. The walls were covered with motivational posters about teamwork that none of us believed in. And my boss, Grant, was the kind of man who wore a Rolex just so people would notice it. Every morning he'd stroll in 10 minutes late with that smug grin plastered on his face, clapping his hands like he owned everyone's soul. Let's make some magic, people, he'd say, which was ironic because he hadn't had an original idea since 2009. I was a marketing strategist on paper, but mostly I was the guy who stayed late fixing everyone else's presentations and brainstorming ideas that Grant would later claim as his own. He'd call me the idealist in front of clients like it was an insult. Ethan here loves his big picture nonsense, he'd laugh. We like to keep him around for optimism. Everyone would chuckle and I'd fake a smile, pretending it didn't sting, but it did. Every damn time. I was living in a small one-bedroom apartment in East Austin with my girlfriend, Lena, who worked as a nurse. We'd been together for almost 4 years, and for most of that time, she'd been the practical one. The voice that told me to pay rent before buying another domain name. The one who kept us grounded. But lately, even her patience had started to crack. Every time I talked about building something of my own, about creating an app that could help small creators track and grow their audiences without selling their souls to big platforms, she'd give me that tired smile. Babe, she'd say, You've been chasing these side projects for years. Maybe it's time to focus on something real. I try to explain how I could see it. Clear as day. A platform called Linkly. Something simple, efficient, and built for people like me who were tired of algorithms deciding their worth. But all she'd hear was another dream that might never pay rent. The night before everything went to hell, we argued about it again. You're almost 30, Ethan, she said, her voice calm but sharp. You can't keep acting like life's a waiting room for your big idea. Maybe it's time to accept that not everyone's meant to be a founder. I didn't answer. I just looked at the flickering city lights outside our window and felt that hollow ache of being misunderstood by the one person you thought would always believe in you. The next morning, I walked into the office determined to finally do something. Our company had been trying to land a big client, some influencer agency that needed a smarter way to manage audience engagement. I'd spent weeks crafting a pitch for them, polishing every slide until it felt bulletproof. It was the first time I truly believed one of my ideas could change things. I sent it to Grant before the presentation, expecting him to be impressed. Instead, he just replied, "We'll take it from here." When the meeting started, I stood in the corner as Grant strutted in with his fancy tie and fake charisma, and to my shock, he started presenting my slides, my data, my words, even the same examples I'd used. "This," he said, pacing in front of the big screen, "is how we revolutionize audience analytics, a tool that understands creators instead of exploiting them." The board nodded, impressed, and every cell in my body went cold. I watched as Grant took credit for every ounce of work I'd poured into that project. No mention of me, no acknowledgement, just his smug face soaking in the praise. When it ended, he patted me on the shoulder and whispered, "You're a good team player, Ethan. Don't forget that." Something inside me snapped. I didn't plan it. I didn't think it through. I just walked back to my desk, opened my laptop, and typed my resignation email right there. The subject line read, "I'm done." I didn't bother explaining why. When I handed it to HR, Grant tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Ethan, don't be dramatic. You'll regret this. People like you don't just build something out of nothing." I remember looking at him and feeling this strange calm wash over me. "Watch me," I said, and I walked out. The Austin sun was brutal that afternoon, and by the time I got home, I felt both liberated and terrified. I told Lena what happened, expecting her to hug me, to tell me she was proud I finally stood up for myself. Instead, she went silent. "You quit?" she asked, "without another job lined up?" I nodded, and her eyes filled with disappointment. "Ethan, I can't keep doing this. Every time something goes wrong, you burn everything down and start over. I need stability. I need someone who knows what they're doing." I tried to explain that this was my chance to finally build Linkly for real, that all I needed was time, but she just shook her head. "I'm tired of dating potential," she whispered, and that sentence hit harder than anything Grant ever said. That night, she packed her things. She didn't cry, neither did I. I just sat there, staring at the half-empty closet, realizing I'd lost my job, my girlfriend, and the little stability I had, all in one day. The following week was a blur. Bills piled up, and the apartment felt too big, too quiet. I sold my TV and half my furniture just to make rent, but it wasn't enough. That's when I called Noah, my college friend, who'd always been the kind of guy who found humor in everything. When I told him what happened, he didn't judge me. He just said, "Dude, get your ass over here. I've got a spare room and a mini fridge with expired beer." I moved into his place the next day. It wasn't glamorous. A small 2-bedroom house in South Austin with mismatched furniture and a dog that hated me. But it was a start. Noah worked nights as a sound engineer, so we'd barely cross paths except when he'd come home at 2 a.m., drop on the couch, and ask, "So, start a billionaire yet?" I'd laugh it off, but every time he said it, it reminded me of what I wanted to become. I spent my days freelancing, designing logos, managing small ad campaigns, anything that paid $50, and my nights sketching ideas for Linkly. I didn't have fancy equipment, just an old laptop with a cracked screen and a stubborn Wi-Fi connection, but for the first time in years, I felt a spark. I'd sit on that creaky desk in Noah's spare room, coffee in hand, scrolling through creator forums, reading what small content creators struggled with. They hated being slaves to algorithms. They wanted tools that made growth measurable, not mystical. That's when I realized my idea wasn't just a dream. It was a necessity. The problem was, I had no money, no team, and no one who believed in me. But maybe that was a good thing. There's a strange freedom in having nothing left to lose. The first few weeks were brutal. Some nights I'd question everything. Was I chasing a fantasy? I'd think about Lena's words, about how she said I wasn't built for this. I'd think about Grant laughing with his boardroom buddies, probably taking a victory lap for his idea. But every time I pictured his smug face, something inside me ignited. I didn't want to prove him wrong just for revenge. I wanted to build something undeniable, something that would make the entire world see me differently. So I started small. I taught myself to code, using free online tutorials and whatever scraps of knowledge I could find. I'd stay up until sunrise, debugging errors that made no sense, then crash on the couch for a few hours before freelancing again. Noah would sometimes find me passed out with my laptop still on, and he'd just shake his head. "You're insane," he'd say. "Yeah," I'd reply, but maybe insane's what it takes. Money was always tight. I remember one morning when I had $47 left in my account, and a week before rent was due. I skipped meals just to afford server hosting. The hunger made me dizzy sometimes, but weirdly, it also made me sharper. Desperation has a way of clarifying priorities. I started reaching out to small creators on Reddit and Discord, offering them free, early access to Linkly if they gave me feedback. Most ignored me. A few were curious. One guy, a podcaster from Chicago, told me, "If you actually pull this off, man, you're going to change the game." That one message kept me going for weeks. It was the validation I needed. Not from a boss, not from a girlfriend, but from someone who believed in what I was trying to do. Then came the night everything changed. Or at least the night I stopped feeling sorry for myself. It was late, maybe 3 a.m. Noah was asleep. The house silent except for the hum of his old AC. I sat there staring at a blank screen, feeling like maybe everyone was right. Maybe I was just another dreamer who couldn't deliver. I almost shut the laptop, but then I remembered Grant's words. People like you don't just build something out of nothing. And I swear, something inside me shifted. I opened a new file, named it Linkly_V1, and started typing. The first line of code was simple, barely functional, but it felt sacred. I wasn't just coding an app. I was coding my comeback, my revenge, my future. I whispered to myself, if no one believes in me, I'll make them wish they did. And for the first time in months, I smiled. It wasn't a confident smile. It was the kind of smile you wear when you know the road ahead will destroy you if you're not careful, but you're willing to walk it anyway. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even feel tired. I just kept writing, line after line, watching the skeleton of something real take shape. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fast, but it was mine. Every click of the keyboard was a small act of defiance against everyone who said I couldn't. By sunrise, I had a crude prototype, ugly but functional. I stared at it until my eyes burned. For the first time, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a builder. And somewhere between exhaustion and adrenaline, I realized that rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the foundation I needed to start over. When Noah woke up and saw me still working, he handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You look like hell." I grinned. Maybe. This is the first time hell feels like home. And that's how it began. My life didn't magically change that day. No investors knocked on my door. No applause followed. But something deeper shifted. The decision that no matter how long it took, I was going to build Linkly from nothing. Not for money, not for revenge, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could. That I wasn't crazy for believing I could make something out of nothing. That I wasn't potential, I was progress. And as the morning light spilled through that tiny window, illuminating the dust in the air, I promised myself one thing. I would never again let anyone else define my worth. I'd build it with my own hand, one line of code at a time. I never thought I'd end up coding my future from a garage, but somehow, there I was, sprawled across a mattress that barely fit the corner of Noah's cluttered garage. My laptop balanced on my knees as wires snaked across the concrete floor like veins, humming with the promise of something that might actually work. The air smelled faintly of motor oil, dust, and stale coffee, and Noah had set up a small heater in the corner that barely did anything except make me sweat when I leaned too close. By day, I was still hustling for freelance gigs, logos, social media campaigns, even the occasional sketch for a small coffee shop trying to brand themselves. But by night, my world belonged to Linkly. Every keystroke felt like digging myself out of the pit I landed in, and yet, some days, it felt like the pit was endless, bottomless, swallowing all the energy and optimism I tried to hold onto. Reddit became both a weapon and a battlefield. I'd post about my app, asking for feedback, and immediately be met with comments like, "wannabe marketing app," or "just another tool nobody will use." I'd read those words, my stomach nodding, but I couldn't stop. Every insult, every snarky remark fueled me. I printed out free startup guides, PDFs, articles, anything I could study while freelancing by day, coding by night. I watched endless videos of people talking about growth hacks, user retention, and viral loops, scribbling notes on napkins and sticky notes, pasting them to the walls of the garage like commandments I had to obey to survive. Noah became my lifeline during those nights. Even though he worked long, exhausting shifts as a sound engineer, he'd somehow find the patience to check in on me, bringing me microwaved leftovers or a cup of coffee when I hadn't moved for hours. "You're doing the work others are too scared to start," he'd say, sitting on a stool and watching me debug another feature that refused to load. "Don't forget why you're doing this." And I clung to those words like oxygen, because without them, I might have collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and doubt. Money was always tight, tighter than I'd imagined possible. I remember a week where I skipped meals for 3 days just to afford hosting fees. The electricity got cut off once, and I had to sit in a coffee shop until 2 in the morning, headphones in, coding furiously as the staff gave me side-eye every time I refilled my third cup of black coffee. Every sound of someone laughing, chatting, or clinking cups reminded me of a world I'd temporarily been kicked out of, a world that was moving on while I dug my way out of the shadows. The nights were long, unrelenting, and sometimes I wanted to scream at the universe for being so cruel. But then I glance at my screen and see the code coming together, the skeleton of something real, something that might finally be mine, and the despair would fade into determination. I started finding small victories, Little moments where Linkly would do exactly what I'd envisioned, even in the most imperfect way. When one creator messaged me saying that a simple analytics feature helped them grow their podcast audience by 10% in a week, it felt like winning a championship I'd never trained for. Those tiny wins became the heartbeat that kept me alive, the proof that the grind wasn't meaningless. Every failure, every rejection, every laugh from strangers online became bricks I laid to build a fortress around my determination. And soon I started seeing patterns, user behaviors, trends, niches I could optimize for, and I exploited them tirelessly, sometimes coding until my fingers bled and my eyes felt like they were going to snap shut. I had no choice. I either made Linkly work or I became a statistic of wasted potential. 6 months blurred into a haze of sleepless nights, caffeine overdoses, and lonely mornings spent in a garage that smelled like desperation. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, everything changed. I was reviewing user feedback from a handful of early adopters, tweaking a dashboard feature that seemed simple but was vital to the people actually using Linkly, when I noticed an email notification pop up. A YouTuber with 1 million subscribers had discovered Linkly, played around with it, and uploaded a video calling it a game changer for creators, while showcasing the dashboard, the analytics, and the simplicity I'd fought for night after night. I clicked on the link and froze. In just 1 hour, the user count had jumped from 200 to over 5,000. By the end of the day, it was 20,000, and the notifications didn't stop. People were signing up, sending messages, asking questions, offering to beta test, and even pitching partnership ideas. My inbox overflowed with opportunities I hadn't dreamed of, and for a brief moment, I felt my chest tighten with disbelief. This wasn't just luck. This was the grind paying off. The nights of coding in a dusty garage finally manifesting into something tangible. I remember calling Noah, who picked up groggily at first. "Dude, you're on fire," he said, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice, as if he still hadn't processed that his roommate, the guy who once slept on a mattress in his garage, was suddenly being noticed by thousands of people. "Yeah," I said, almost whispering, "but it's just the beginning." Suddenly, the investors who had ignored my emails for months, the same people who laughed when I said I wanted to build a platform for creators, started calling. And then Grant's company reached out too, pretending to explore collaboration. The irony wasn't lost on me. The guy who had stolen my idea and laughed at me in a boardroom suddenly wanted a piece of the pie I'd spent half a year building from scratch, blood and caffeine running through every line of code. I read each email, each message, and every time, I felt that familiar anger rise. That old fire that had refused to die back when I was broke and sleeping on someone else's couch. But instead of lashing out, I smiled. I typed one line in every reply. "You told me I'd never make it. Guess I did anyway." I hit send, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and calm. I didn't need their money, their validation, or their approval anymore. I had created something real, something people wanted, something that existed because of me and me alone. But deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning of the war. Success attracts envy, and I could already feel the shadow of it creeping toward me. I'd worked too hard, bled too many nights, and endured too much ridicule to let anyone take this lightly. Every new subscriber, every new email, every small win was a reminder of what I'd built out of nothing, and I refused to let anyone undermine it again. The garage, the coffee shop nights, the endless debugging, the mockery, the empty stomachs, they were all part of the story that had forged me, and I was determined that the world would know it. I started thinking about scaling, about hiring, about turning this small, clunky prototype into something sleek, powerful, unstoppable. And as I watched my email ping relentlessly with messages of support, interest, and excitement, I felt that strange, electrifying certainty that comes only when you know you've survived hell and walked into sunlight. I remember one night, 6 months into the grind, sitting on the garage floor with my laptop open, the lights dimmed to a flickering yellow, watching Linkly's user count tick upward in real time. Noah had brought me a plate of spaghetti he'd made at 1 a.m., muttering something about how weird it is that this might actually work, and I laughed, too tired to argue. I leaned back, exhausted, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to feel the enormity of what I'd done. I was no longer the guy everyone laughed at, the idealist with big dreams and no results. I was a creator, a builder, a man who had clawed his way from the depths of failure and emerged with something real in his hands. And even as I knew challenges were coming, investors, competitors, copycats, and people like Grant trying to worm their way back into relevance, I also knew something else. I had the resilience, the hunger, and the stubbornness to survive them all. From that dim garage in South Austin, surrounded by wires, notes, and empty coffee cups, I made a promise to myself that no matter how high the walls rose, no matter how fierce the storm, I would keep grinding, keep building, and keep proving to everyone, including myself, that the kid who once slept on a mattress in a friend's garage could rise, thrive, and outsmart anyone who ever doubted him. And as the user count continued to climb into the tens of thousands, I whispered to the empty garage, to the ghosts of doubt and ridicule that had haunted me for years. This is just a start, and they have no idea what's coming next. When I finally walked into our new office for the first time, I could hardly believe it was real. Gone were the nights spent coding in Noah's dusty garage and surviving on microwave spaghetti, replaced now by glass walls, ergonomic chairs, and enough monitors to make a gaming convention jealous. And I remember standing in the middle of the open floor, my heart thumping like I'd just crossed some invisible finish line, thinking how far I'd come, since everyone, Grant, Lena, even some friends I thought would support me, had written me off as a dreamer with no future. And now, here I was, 37 employees, a team of passionate creators and coders who actually believed in Linkly, buzzing around like neurons firing in a brain, everyone focused, alive, the hum of productivity mingling with faint music from someone's Spotify playlist. And there in the corner sat Maya, my college friend and the one developer who never doubted me, fiddling with her code as usual, and the sight of her reminded me how much of this journey was built on loyalty and those rare souls who stayed when the world walked away. And I walked over, feeling that surge of gratitude and momentum, telling her, "We made it." And she smirked without looking up, eyes sparkling. "You did. Now let's make it unforgettable." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just about proving Grant wrong or making money. It was about building something that would outlive all the noise, the doubters, the nights I spent starving and unsure if the next morning would bring anything but debt and humiliation. And in the first few months, revenue started trickling in, then flooding as sponsorship deals rolled in, partnerships formed, and our loyal user base became a small army of creators evangelizing Linkly in forums, Discord servers, and YouTube videos. And suddenly, I wasn't just Ethan from the garage. I was Ethan, the guy who had built something that people actually wanted, people who were excited, people who respected the work. And as I gave talks at conferences, standing on stages, and seeing nods from people who had once laughed at my Reddit posts, I felt a mixture of vindication and clarity. Validation from others was no longer the fuel, it was the byproduct, the nice garnish on top of the real meal, which was proving to myself that I could do it, that I could create and lead, and yet the universe has a way of reminding you that your triumph will always attract old ghosts. And one morning, while scanning my inbox, I saw an email from Grant's company. Subject line bolded, "Proposal, acquisition of Linkly," and my stomach sank, not from fear, but from the absurdity of it all. The man who had stolen my idea and laughed as I quit my job was now offering $10 million, probably hoping to swallow us before his own copycat app tanked. And almost immediately after, Lena reached out via text. The same girl who had left me because she was tired of dating potential, suddenly framing herself as wanting closure. But I could see the hunger beneath the words, the curiosity, the subtle attempt to get back in, and I didn't respond immediately, savoring the irony, letting the anticipation simmer, knowing that I had the power now that I hadn't had in years. And when I finally agreed to meet both of them separately, the encounters were electric, full of tension, subtle revenge, and poetic justice that I savored quietly. With Grant, I met at a trendy Austin coffee shop, the kind with exposed brick and overpriced lattes, and as he sipped his macchiato, smiling that smug, know-it-all grin, I smiled back, calm and collected, and listened as he tried to pitch how I should sell Linkly, subtly reminding me of my failures in the past. And when he asked if I'd consider $10 million, I leaned back, letting the pause stretch, letting the ghosts of every insult, every stolen idea, every mocking laugh weigh in on the moment. And I finally said, "You told me I'd never make it. Guess I did anyway." And his face twitched imperceptibly, that faint spark of irritation mixed with disbelief. I walked away, savoring every step as he sat there, realizing I wasn't the same guy he thought he could control. Lena was a different kind of encounter, meeting at a quiet bar where the lights were dim and the smell of whiskey hung in the air. And she tried the same old charm, soft voice, almost apologetic, talking about closure and catching up, pretending she cared about my journey rather than the fact that I was now untouchable in a way she couldn't manipulate. And I listened, nodding politely, letting her fill the space with her words, and then I smiled, the kind of smile that was calm, confident, untouchable, and said, "I'm glad you reached out. I've changed too, just not for you." Leaving her blinking in the dim light, unsure of whether to feel hurt or impressed, and walking out of that bar, the crisp Austin night air hitting my face, I felt lighter, freer, finally untethered from the ghosts of my past. But the universe had one more test for me, one more cruel, ironic twist. Betrayal from within. One of my own employees had been leaking private data to Grant's company, selling secrets for a few $1,000s, thinking they could play the system while I was building something that mattered. And when I found out, my chest sank, a heavy weight of disbelief, anger, and exhaustion pressing down like it could crush me. And I felt the sting of that same humiliation I'd known when Grant stole my ideas, and yet I realized something crucial. I had the grit, the cunning, the same street-smart determination that had gotten me from a garage to this office to survive it. And I quietly began gathering evidence, tracing emails, analyzing server logs, confirming dates. And when I finally exposed the betrayal in a public address at a company town hall, calling out the leak while highlighting our user-first ethics, transparency, and growth, the employee was left speechless. The team rallied behind me, and even Grant's people had to retract and apologize publicly. And the poetic justice of it, the satisfaction of seeing the tables turned so publicly, was more powerful than any paycheck or offer. And after that, Linkly became untouchable in the small ecosystem we were dominating. By the end of the year, we were among the fastest growing startups in the creator economy, attracting partnerships with platforms I had once only dreamed of, sponsors who wanted to be associated with our authenticity, and users who had stayed loyal since the early beta, people who had seen the grind, the sleepless nights, the endless coffee-fueled coding marathons. And as I stood on stages at conferences, giving talks about growth, persistence, and believing in ideas when everyone else laughs, I felt a profound shift inside me. I was no longer chasing validation. I was commanding respect, my name whispered with admiration where once it had been mocked, and as I looked out over the audience, seeing faces light up with recognition, hearing applause that felt earned rather than bought, I realized the war wasn't over. There would always be envy, competition, people trying to undermine you, but I had survived betrayal, sabotage, theft, and doubt, and I had emerged not just victorious, but untouchable. And sitting back in my corner office late one night, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls, I smiled, knowing that Linkly was no longer just a startup. It was a statement, a monument to persistence, loyalty, and cunning. And as I sipped my coffee, scrolling through the growth metrics and seeing engagement, revenue, and partnerships hitting numbers I'd once thought impossible, I whispered quietly to myself, this is just the beginning. Let them watch. Let them try. I've already won what they never understood I could have. Standing on the stage of the largest tech conference in Austin, staring out at a sea of faces that stretched farther than I could see, I felt a strange combination of nerves and triumph, my heart hammering in a way I hadn't felt since the nights in Noah's garage when my stomach was empty. The Wi-Fi was slow and every line of code felt like it was begging me to quit. But now, the lights were bright, the hum of the audience electric, and among the crowd were the very people who had once tried to define the limits of my potential. Grant, sitting stiffly in the third row, his smug grin tamed into a polite mask that barely concealed the surprise I knew he felt. And Lena, whose eyes flicked between curiosity and admiration, the same woman who had left me for potential and now watched as that potential had solidified into something undeniable. And I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs and your chest with fire and memory, remembering every insult, every sneer, every night spent questioning whether I had the strength to continue. And I began speaking, not with vengeance or bitterness, but with calm authority and humility, telling the story of Linkly, of the sleepless nights, the countless rejections, the people who laughed at me on forums and said I'd never make it. And I looked them straight in the eye without pointing fingers and said, saying, "You were my fuel." And the room went quiet for a moment, a suspended silence that felt like recognition and respect all at once, the kind of silence that comes when someone has truly earned their place. And I continued, explaining how the grind, the failures, and the persistence had forged not just a product, but a community, a platform that empowered creators, small businesses, and anyone with a dream that the world tried to smother. And I watched as Grant shifted uneasily in his chair, probably realizing that the company he had tried to build with the shortcuts, copied ideas, and hollow strategies had collapsed under the weight of genuine innovation, transparency, and care for users. And it wasn't just collapse. It was public, visible, undeniable, with headlines everywhere chronicling the implosion of the copycat app while Linkly soared in downloads, engagement, and reputation. And I could feel the poetic justice settling in. That subtle warmth of satisfaction that doesn't need to be flaunted, that only those who lived through the struggle can understand. And Lena's presence was a different kind of echo. Her attempts to rekindle what she had abandoned, a quiet reminder of how people sometimes realize the value of something after it's out of their reach. And when she tried to approach me after the keynote, her voice soft, tinged with regret and longing, I smiled, calm, measured, and said, "I did too, just not for you." And the words felt like closure, not cruelty, a natural punctuation on a chapter of my life that had once been full of doubt, and then the conference moved on. The panels continued, but I stayed on the periphery of the chaos long enough to take it all in. The way the spotlight had shifted, the respect that had been earned, the silence that was now replaced with chatter, applause, and admiration. And I realized in that moment that I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to humiliate anyone, because the work itself was the ultimate vindication, the tangible proof of nights spent coding, nights spent hungry, nights spent in doubt, and now seeing my platform thriving, revenue climbing, partnerships multiplying, and user testimonials flooding in. I felt a surge of something deeper than triumph. It was serenity born from persistence, the knowledge that I had outsmarted, outworked, and remained unstoppable in the face of everything the world threw at me. And when I finally returned to my office, which now overlooked the Austin skyline from a penthouse that felt both surreal and deserved, I walked past walls adorned with awards, articles, and screenshots of news coverage, and I paused at the corner where my first ever laptop still sat, screen glowing faintly, displaying the very first line of code I had written for Linkly, that fragile, raw spark that had ignited a movement. And I ran my fingers over the keys, remembering the nights spent debugging, the moments of despair, the small victories that had added up to this empire. And I reflected on how Grant's downfall had been inevitable once I had the courage to build something authentic, how Lena's return had been a fleeting shadow compared to the loyalty and dedication of my team, and how every mentor, every late night call, every small thank you from a struggling creator had mattered more than any paycheck, any investor, or any recognition from people who had doubted me. And I realized that the greatest revenge isn't proving others wrong. It's building something so impactful, so enduring, that you stop caring whether anyone was right or wrong to begin with. That success becomes less about accolades and more about the lives you touch, the inspiration you spark, and the communities you create. And I decided from that moment that my wealth would not just be measured in dollars, but in the doors I could open for other struggling entrepreneurs, especially the ones laughed at, underestimated, or ignored, mentoring them, guiding them, giving them the same fuel that had carried me through the darkest times. Because if I had learned anything from my journey, it was that sharing knowledge and opportunity multiplies impact far beyond what any single person could achieve alone. And in the evenings, I would still sit on the balcony, my favorite ritual, overlooking the city lights twinkling like scattered stars across the urban sprawl. My laptop open beside me, glowing faintly with the first lines of code, a tangible reminder of the leap from nothing to everything. And as the wind brushed against my face, cool and grounding, I whispered softly, almost to myself, I built this from nothing, and now nothing can break me. And in that simple affirmation, I felt the culmination of years of struggle, persistence, betrayal, doubt, and triumph condensed into a single, perfect moment of peace and power. The kind of moment that makes every sleepless night, every pang of hunger, every mocking comment, every heartbreak and setback worth it. Because not only had I succeeded, I had transcended the need for validation, outsmarted those who doubted me, built a legacy from scratch, and in the quiet solitude of that balcony overlooking Austin, I understood that true victory isn't just having the world notice, it's having the world move on while you continue to thrive on your own terms, unstoppable, unshakable, and unapologetically alive. The end. I loved someone who was keeping a secret that could ruin us. I never believed in love at first sight. Not really, but the night I met Ethan, I felt like every cheesy romantic cliche suddenly made sense. And I hated myself a little for falling into it so fast because it wasn't just a crush, it was that weird magnetic pull you read about in books where two people somehow click instantly, like puzzle pieces that had been waiting for decades to find each other. It was at this party my friend had thrown in her tiny but cozy apartment in Chicago, the kind where everyone was a little too loud, the music just a touch too fast, and the air smelled faintly of beer and candle wax. And I was just standing in the corner, nursing my third glass of red wine, feeling awkward and tired from a week that had drained me emotionally and mentally, when he appeared, leaning casually against the kitchen counter with that slightly crooked smile that somehow made him look both mischievous and genuinely kind. And I remember thinking, okay, this is ridiculous. He's handsome, he's funny, and he's staring right at me like he knows a secret I don't. And before I could overthink it, he walked over and introduced himself. Ethan, 26, charming, ridiculously well-dressed without looking like he tried too hard. And we started talking, and it was like the room shrank, like everyone else disappeared because we clicked instantly, talking about everything from our favorite childhood cartoons to the books that shaped us, to the weirdly specific dreams we had about living in small coastal towns and starting cafes with bookstores attached. And it was intoxicating. That effortless conversation where the minutes felt like seconds and the seconds stretched into hours, and somehow I left that night thinking, this is different. This is special. Even if my brain kept whispering warnings about moving too fast, about falling too hard, but my heart refused to listen. Over the next few weeks, we fell into this whirlwind of dates, the kind that were simultaneously exciting and comforting. Long walks along the lakeshore, movie nights that turned into philosophical debates about life, and mornings where we cooked breakfast together while sharing inside jokes that made absolutely no sense to anyone else. And I loved how he looked at me when I was being silly, how he laughed when I accidentally burned the toast or spilled coffee on myself, how he somehow remembered tiny details I didn't think I'd ever mentioned. And I found myself thinking about him constantly, sending him stupid texts in the middle of the day just to see if he was thinking about me too. And for the most part, it felt perfect, almost unreal. But then there were the tiny cracks that I tried desperately to ignore because I was too caught up in the high of being in love. The way he sometimes got distant on the phone, staring at something I couldn't see before answering. The way his phone buzzed at odd hours and he would step into another room or leave abruptly. His explanations, plausible enough, but always leaving me with this lingering unease that I couldn't shake no matter how much I told myself it was nothing. And I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe he just had a busy job, that maybe everyone deserved a little privacy, that maybe I was just overthinking it. But even as I brushed it off, I couldn't ignore the little things, like the time he disappeared for hours on a Saturday, saying he had to handle something personal, or the night his phone lit up with a text he quickly hid from me, and the look on his face, a fleeting shadow of worry or guilt that made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't felt before. And I hated that I noticed, hated that my mind automatically assumed the worst, but my heart wanted to trust him. And I was torn between the two, between the love that made me feel alive and the unease that whispered there was more to Ethan than he was letting on. And yet, every time he held my hand, every time he brushed a strand of hair from my face, every time he said something as simple as, "I love how you see the world, Rose," it was like he was carving a permanent space in my life, and I wanted to believe in him fully, even if a tiny voice in the back of my head screamed that secrets had a way of unraveling everything. And I remember one evening, about a month into our whirlwind romance, we were sitting on a small apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling below us, the air crisp, but the warmth of our bodies and our laughter filling the space between us. And he kissed me softly, lingering just enough that my heart felt like it would burst. And I whispered, "I've never felt this way before." And he smiled, but then his phone buzzed, and the smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he said, "Just work stuff. Don't worry about it." And I wanted to believe him. I really did. But my gut twisted in that familiar knot of suspicion, and I realized that maybe the love I was feeling was also a test, a fragile balance between trust and doubt, and I had no idea which way it would tip. And then there was the incident that night, seemingly small but impossible to ignore. A knock at the door when I least expected it, a masked anxiety in Ethan's eyes when he opened it, the hurried conversation in hushed tones, a brief flash of something, a look, a word, a name that I couldn't quite catch but which lodged itself in my memory like a warning sign flashing in neon. And I remember standing there, frozen, wanting to ask, to demand answers, but feeling my chest tighten, afraid that if I pushed too hard, I might shatter the fragile perfection we had built in these past few weeks. And so I smiled, pretending to be oblivious, laughed along when he returned with that same easy charm. But inside, I knew something had changed, a subtle shift in the air, the first crack in the world I thought was invincible. And I realized then that this relationship, as magical and intense as it felt, came with shadows, tiny and almost invisible at first, but enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the man who had somehow stolen my heart in less than a month. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening, I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of hope, excitement, and the gnawing, persistent fear that the secret Ethan carried might not just affect him, but might destroy us both before I even had a chance to truly hold on. And I whispered into the darkness, not sure if he could hear me. "I hope I'm ready for whatever this is." Because deep down, I had a feeling I wasn't, and maybe that's what made it so real, so intoxicating, and so terrifying at the same time. It started with small things. Tiny inconsistencies that at first I tried to ignore because I loved Ethan, and loving someone like him made you want to see the best in them, even when the cracks were right in front of your eyes. But the more time I spent with him, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that parts of him existed in shadows, places I wasn't allowed to see, like when he told me about his family vacations, casual stories about trips he had supposedly taken with friends, and then I realized the details were always vague, never dates, never who else was there, just fleeting mentions like, "Oh, it was fun, you'd have liked it," or "We went there a few years back." And I couldn't help but feel a strange pang of suspicion because I remembered asking specific questions once, innocuous ones about a hotel or a restaurant, and he'd somehow sidestepped them so gracefully that I felt foolish for even noticing. And then there were the times his phone would light up when we were together, and though he always smiled and said, "It's nothing, don't worry," I started to notice patterns, late night texts, quick messages he would delete before I could see, and once, a voicemail from someone with a voice that made my stomach twist with an unexplainable dread. And I realized I had no idea who some of the people in his life actually were. And friends, those little voices that sometimes seem insignificant until they're impossible to ignore, began planting seeds I couldn't unhear. My best friend took in Jenna over coffee one Saturday morning, casually remarked, "You know, Ethan's not exactly an open book," with that subtle hint of knowing that immediately put me on edge. And I laughed it off nervously, forcing the conversation elsewhere, but the words stuck in my mind. And another time, my coworker, who had met him once at a work function, muttered something about mysterious disappearances and selective sharing, and suddenly I couldn't pretend anymore. Memories started surfacing like shadows in sunlight. Times he had avoided telling me things, trips he claimed were business related but were too long for a normal meeting, vague mentions of family obligations he never elaborated on, Moments when I caught a flicker of guilt in his eyes when I asked about a friend or a colleague, and I began questioning myself obsessively to see if I was imagining it all, if my love was clouding my judgment, and yet every time he looked at me with that soft, earnest smile, the one that made my heart feel like it could shatter and mend at the same time, I wanted to trust him completely. And that inner conflict ate at me, twisting excitement and fear into an almost unbearable tension. I started keeping mental notes, little clues that didn't fit, inconsistencies that didn't make sense, and the more I tried to rationalize, the more the puzzle pieces refused to line up neatly. I found myself talking to Jenna more, late night phone calls where I poured my anxiety into the receiver, admitting that I was terrified of losing Ethan, that I was scared he was keeping something from me that I couldn't bear to imagine. And Jenna listened patiently, giving me advice that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear, reminding me gently that love doesn't mean blind trust, and that sometimes protecting your heart meant demanding honesty even if it hurt. And then, one evening, it all came to a head in the most unexpected way. Ethan had left his laptop on the kitchen counter while he went to grab drinks, and for reasons I can't fully explain, my curiosity overpowered my restraint, and I opened it, thinking I would just check a file for a silly joke he had promised to show me earlier. And that's when I saw it. A document, half open, half hidden under layers of folders, with names and dates that made my pulse race and my hands shake, hints of people, places, and events that didn't align with anything he had ever told me. And I froze, staring at the screen, heart hammering in my chest, mind spinning with disbelief, fear, and a burning, aching need to understand. And I realized I was holding the first tangible evidence that he had been keeping a secret from me, a piece of a hidden life I hadn't been allowed to enter, and the weight of it crashed over me in waves, because part of me wanted to close it immediately, to pretend I hadn't seen anything and protect my love. But another part of me needed answers, needed the truth, even if the truth threatened to unravel everything I had built with him, and I felt tears prick my eyes, not just from shock, but from the betrayal I hadn't yet fully understood. I couldn't bring myself to confront him right away, not when my emotions were raw and explosive, so I shoved the laptop closed, pretending I hadn't noticed anything when he returned, and yet the tension between us was suddenly palpable, like a fragile thread stretched to the breaking point, and all the little inconsistencies, all the vague explanations, all the shadows in his stories that I had tried to ignore suddenly crystallized into a gnawing certainty that something in his life was deliberately hidden. And I found myself lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every unexplained absence, and asking myself how I could love someone so deeply and yet feel like I barely knew them at all. And my mind oscillated between fear and hope, because I loved him enough to believe in him, enough to give him the benefit of the doubt, yet terrified that, when the truth emerged, it would shatter the delicate world we had built. And I realized then that love wasn't simple, wasn't just candlelit dinners and whispered, "I love yous." It was also waiting with bated breath, heart in your throat, for someone to trust you enough to show who they really are, and I had no idea if Ethan would ever do that, and the uncertainty gnawed at me in ways I hadn't known were possible, making every laugh, every kiss, every small shared moment simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, because behind the warmth and the affection, there was this shadow, this unknown, and I was caught between wanting to confront it immediately and wanting to preserve the fragile perfection of what we had, and I realized with a sinking feeling in my chest that the next step, the moment I chose to uncover the truth or continue pretending ignorance, would change everything, because love and secrets I was learning were dangerous together, and I wasn't sure if my heart would survive the collision when the shadow finally stepped into the light. The morning I decided I couldn't ignore the truth any longer, I felt this strange mixture of dread and determination twisting in my chest like a live thing, because I had spent weeks oscillating between hope and fear, analyzing every word Ethan had ever said, replaying every late night text, every fleeting look of guilt, every unexplained absence, and that one night staring at his laptop, the evidence half hidden yet undeniable, and I realized I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them from him. Not whispered rumors or half glimpses from friends who didn't know the full story. So I arranged to meet him at our favorite little coffee shop downtown, the one with the mismatched chairs and the window that overlooked a city street where the lights twinkled, like they were winking at me, trying to soothe the panic in my chest. And when I saw him walk in, hair slightly mussed, jacket thrown casually over his shoulder, that same crooked smile playing at his lips, I wanted to run across the street and throw myself into his arms, but I reminded myself that today wasn't about kisses or laughter, it was about truth. And the moment he spotted me, his smile faltered just slightly, just enough for me to know he could sense a storm brewing inside me, and we sat down at our usual corner table, the one tucked away enough for privacy, but open enough to feel connected to the world. And I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to memorize the way his eyes darted nervously before he met mine, and then, finally, I asked, in a voice steadier than I felt, "Ethan, what is going on? What are you hiding from me?" And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced because it wasn't the absence of words. It was the weight of all the things left unsaid, and I could see it in him. The conflict, the fear, the vulnerability, and then, slowly, he exhaled. And for the first time, he really looked at me, the kind of look that stripped away all pretense. And he started to speak, each word measured, hesitant at first, but growing steadier as he realized that hiding had become impossible. "Rose, I owe you the truth. I've been keeping something from you, something I didn't know how to share because I was afraid it would ruin us, and maybe it still will." And I felt my stomach drop because I had imagined so many secrets, from someone else to hidden debts to family complications. And now the moment of truth had arrived, and he continued. "A year ago, before we met, I was in a relationship that ended badly. And when I say badly, I mean there were legal issues, financial complications, and my ex still occasionally comes up in ways I can't control completely. I didn't want to drag you into that. I didn't want to risk losing what we have because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you before it even began." And I felt tears prick my eyes, a mix of relief and hurt because it was true. It was human, it was complicated, and yet the betrayal I felt from being kept in the dark was sharp, a sting I couldn't ignore. And I said, voice trembling, "You didn't trust me enough to tell me, Ethan. We've shared so much, laughed so much, held each other when we were scared, and you couldn't tell me this?" And his hand reached for mine across the table, shaking slightly, and I could feel the sincerity in the warmth of his touch. "I was scared, Rose, scared I'd lose you if you knew, scared that the truth would make you run, scared I wasn't strong enough to face it with you, but I promise you, everything I've done since has been about us, about protecting what we have and building something real with you." And I wanted to believe him, desperately, because the love I felt for him was still alive, still pulsing through every nerve in my body. But I also felt the ache of being second to his fears, the pain of realizing that love doesn't erase mistakes or secrets. And we talked for hours, really talked, about trust, boundaries, loyalty, forgiveness, and the future, about what honesty means when fear and love collide, about how mistakes don't define a person, but hiding them can damage everything. And I listened to him explain late night calls that weren't lies but attempts to handle his past without hurting me, the financial struggles he had quietly managed to protect us from, and the family complications he had shielded me from. And with each revelation, I felt a mixture of heartbreak and understanding, anger and empathy, because the man in front of me was flawed but human, and he loved me enough to finally let the shadows step into the light. And I realized that the choice wasn't just about staying or leaving, it was about whether I could accept him fully, past and present, with everything messy and complicated, and whether our love was strong enough to survive not just secrets, but the pain they caused. And in that moment, sitting in the soft glow of the coffee shop, holding his hand as he explained, I felt the first tentative stirrings of forgiveness, because love, I realized, isn't about perfection. It's about honesty, trust, and the courage to face the darkness together. And as we left the shop, walking side by side down the city street, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement, I made a choice, not an easy choice, not a naive one, but a conscious one, to continue loving him while demanding transparency and respect, to acknowledge the mistakes and fears that had threatened us, to rebuild what was shaken but not broken. And in that decision, I felt a strange, profound strength, knowing that the next chapter of us wouldn't be free of challenges, but it would be ours fully, honestly, and without pretense. And I understood finally that love doesn't just survive secrets. It thrives when we choose to confront them, forgive them, and move forward with open hearts, even when it's terrifying. And as Ethan squeezed my hand, whispering, "Thank you for trusting me," I smiled, tears spilling freely, because trust, once broken, can be rebuilt stronger than before. And in that rebuilding, I discovered a deeper connection, a love tempered by truth, honesty, and the courage to face the unknown together. And in that quiet moment, with the city humming around us, I knew that despite the shadows that had existed between us, the light of what we shared was stronger than anything that could have hidden in the corners of our hearts. The end. My sibling tried to take everything from me, so I made them regret it. I always thought I had it all figured out. I was 26, living in New York City, climbing the ladder at a marketing firm that practically worshipped me for my results, and finally able to enjoy the kind of life I'd worked so hard for, the kind that only came after years of scrimping, working overtime, and putting my nose to the grindstone while everyone else seemed to coast by effortlessly. And I loved it. The independence, the little apartment I'd managed to furnish perfectly despite the insane rent, the dinners with friends at places that made you feel like you belonged in a movie, the compliments from clients that never felt like flattery because I knew I'd earned every bit of it. But even as I was celebrating a huge campaign win last Thursday, walking home in the crisp autumn air with a latte in hand, I started noticing little things, tiny cracks in the perfect picture I'd painted for myself, things I had brushed off before, but now made me feel a cold pit in my stomach, like the kind of feeling you get when something is off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And it all led back to Jake, my younger brother, who was 23 and had always been complicated. Growing up, he was the kid who threw tantrums when mom praised me for good grades, who would sneakily take the last slice of pizza just to make me fight for it, who borrowed money for urgent needs and conveniently forgot to pay me back, who had this way of smiling at our parents after subtly undermining my achievements so that I'd look petty or greedy without even realizing it until it was too late. And I had told myself over and over that it was harmless sibling rivalry, just a phase he would grow out of. But then, little things started surfacing. Small incidents that didn't add up, like my credit card statements showing charges I didn't recognize, emails from clients asking about projects I never agreed to, calls from my bank asking to verify suspicious account activity, and a gnawing sense that someone was slowly infiltrating the life I had built from scratch, and I couldn't imagine who it could be until a casual comment from a colleague hit me like a punch to the gut. "Hey Ava, I thought Jake mentioned he was taking over that account." Weird, huh? And suddenly, all the pieces clicked in a horrifying way. Jake, my own brother, was stepping into my professional world, trying to insert himself into my projects, reaching out to clients behind my back, maybe even manipulating contracts and finances so that I would look incompetent. And the betrayal stung more than anything I could have imagined, because it wasn't just about money or career. It was personal. It was about trust, about the person I thought I knew, the person who had been at every birthday, every family dinner, every holiday, smiling and joking like nothing was wrong, all while quietly plotting to take over the life I had fought for. And I remember sitting on my bed that night, staring at my laptop, my hands shaking as I checked account logs and email threads, each click revealing more of his scheming, every line of code, every forwarded email, every unauthorized access. And I felt a combination of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak so sharp it almost made me nauseous, because this wasn't some stranger. It was my brother, the one person I had always believed had my back, the one person who had shared my childhood, and now he was undermining every single thing I had worked for. And I couldn't help replaying every past argument, every time he had subtly twisted words, every sly comment at family gatherings, and realizing that he had been building toward this, slowly but surely, manipulating, lying, and inserting himself into my life like a shadow I hadn't noticed until it was too late. And I remember the moment the full weight hit me when I discovered that he had even accessed my investment accounts, moved funds around, and tried to convince my largest client to switch to a competitor he was handling. And that's when I realized that the perfect life I had built, the career I had painstakingly constructed, the independence I cherished so much, it wasn't untouchable, and the betrayal wasn't just a shock, it was a wake-up call, because the person who should have been my ally was actively trying to destroy me. And the mix of fear, rage, and disbelief that coursed through me that night was so intense that I didn't sleep, pacing my apartment, making lists, taking screenshots, calling banks, trying to secure what was mine, trying to understand how someone so close could be so cruel. And even though a part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to scream and demand answers, another part of me knew that if I reacted without a plan, I would play right into his hands. And so I sat there in the dark, staring at the city skyline through my window, heart pounding, mind racing, and a single clear thought emerged. Jake had made a grave mistake, because I was not the kind of person who could be pushed out or taken advantage of, and whatever he had been planning, whatever schemes he thought would ruin me, I would not only stop him, I would make sure he realized that betraying me came with consequences. And that night, as I finally allowed myself a deep, shaky breath, I made a promise to myself that this was the beginning, not the end, of a battle I intended to win, one that would reclaim my life, my career, and my peace. And maybe, just maybe, teach my brother a lesson he would never forget. I knew I couldn't afford to panic or act impulsively. And so the next days were a blur of silent investigation, my life turning into a quiet war zone where every email, every phone call, every financial statement became a piece of a puzzle I was determined to solve before Jake even realized I was onto him. And I started small, pretending to be clueless while digging deeper, cross-checking account logs, reviewing project files, and speaking to colleagues under the guise of routine check-ins, all while keeping my face calm at family dinners where Jake sat across from me, smug as ever, and mom casually asking if I'd forgiven him for all that confusion with the contracts, which made me want to scream because she still didn't see what was happening right in front of her. And Dad, ever the mediator, telling me to let it go, he's your brother, as if that excused a thud 12 months of sneaky manipulation and blatant theft. And the emotional whiplash of seeing my family defend him while my own life was being hijacked was almost unbearable. But I forced myself to focus because panic wouldn't help me. Only precision and patience would. And then the real evidence began to surface like tiny red flags waving frantically. Documents with my signature forged for deals I never approved, emails sent to clients under my name that twisted facts to make me look incompetent, and even a lawyer's letter meant for an inheritance I hadn't touched yet, but Jake had already tried to claim. And each discovery made my chest tighten with disbelief and my mind race with anger, and I kept thinking, How could he be so bold, so reckless, so utterly blind to the fact that I wasn't a naive little sister anymore, that I knew my worth and that I could fight, and I spent nights scrolling through records on my laptop, checking IP addresses, noting every time he logged into accounts, matching it with phone records and calendar events, and every tiny piece fit together to reveal a shocking truth. Jake hadn't just tried to take a shortcut in life. He had systematically built a web to trap me, to siphon money, ruin my credibility with clients, and even manipulate my parents into thinking I was overreacting or being paranoid. And it was sickening to see how easily he could weave lies and manipulate perceptions because he counted on me being too trusting, too kind. And it was in that trust he underestimated me. And while part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to scream and demand answers, I knew I had to be strategic, because this wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about protecting everything I had worked for, and as I dug deeper, I found messages to my colleagues subtly undermining me, claims that I was unreliable, that I had mishandled projects, suggestions that they should trust him instead, and worst of all, hints that he had been advising clients on their accounts behind my back, giving incorrect information to make me look incompetent, while presenting himself as my trusted assistant. And the betrayal stung so deeply because it wasn't just financial or professional. It was personal, intimate, a direct attack on the trust that should exist between siblings. And while rage burned through me, I forced myself to channel it into analysis, mapping every move, every lie, every betrayal in my notebook with neat, precise lines and diagrams that made the chaos of Jake's actions suddenly feel like something I could manage and eventually control. And yet the hardest part was the family drama. Because when I tried to hint at what I had uncovered, Mom waved it off with a sigh. I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it. And Dad added, "You've always been too sensitive, Ava. Give him a chance." Which made me feel like I was living in an alternate reality where truth and loyalty didn't matter. And I started realizing that Jake had been counting on that too. That by keeping our parents in the dark and manipulating their perception, he could get away with it longer. And that realization steeled my resolve more than anything else, because if he thought I would crumble under emotional manipulation, he was sorely mistaken. And then came the moment that truly tested my composure. The confrontation I had been dreading, yet secretly preparing for in my mind for days, where I cornered him after a dinner gathering, my voice steady but my hands clenched in fists under the table as I calmly laid out everything I had discovered. Every forged signature, every manipulated client email, every attempted financial maneuver, and I expected a flinch, a crack in his smug facade. But instead, Jake smiled, that infuriating, self-satisfied smile, leaned back in his chair and said, "Ava, you're imagining things. You always overreact." And just like that, he tried to gaslight me, to twist the narrative so that I, the person who had uncovered months of deception, looked like the problem, like I was paranoid and unreasonable. And I felt my stomach drop because for a moment, the thought crossed my mind that maybe my family's blind trust in him could make me look insane. But then I remembered every detail, every piece of evidence meticulously documented, every inconsistency that proved he was lying. And I realized that this confrontation wasn't a failure. It was the first step in a larger plan, because now I knew exactly how he would respond, how he would think he had won, and that gave me an edge, a map of his psychology that I could exploit. And I started formulating ways to turn his own confidence against him, ways to expose him without him suspecting it was me, ways to reclaim everything he had tried to steal. And while fear and anger still churned in me, they were tempered now by clarity and strategy because the betrayal had been exposed, the battlefield defined, and the next moves were mine to make. And as I left that confrontation, a quiet, cold determination settled over me. A feeling so potent, it made my pulse quicken, because Jake might have thought he was untouchable, but he had underestimated me completely. And the thought of finally showing him that the person he tried to destroy could outsmart him at every turn was exhilarating, terrifying, and utterly empowering all at once. And that night, lying awake, I drafted the beginnings of a plan in my head, a plan that would require patience, precision, and cunning, a plan that would ensure that by the time Jake realized what had happened, he would have no choice but to face the consequences of every selfish, manipulative act he had committed. And in that moment, I realized that this was no longer just about protecting myself. It was about making him regret every single thing. And the fire that ignited in me that night was one I knew would burn until I had fully reclaimed what was mine. Once I had mapped out every deception Jake had pulled, every lie he had spun, and every account he had touched, I realized that waiting and observing wasn't enough anymore. I had to take control, and I needed a plan that was smarter than anything he could imagine, something that would hit him where it hurt without me getting a single scratch on my own record. And so I began crafting a multi-layered strategy that would expose him professionally, socially, and financially, all while letting him believe he was still in the driver's seat, because nothing fuels a manipulator like the illusion of control. And I knew that if I played my cards right, he would destroy himself with his own arrogance, which made the thought of it almost delicious, almost satisfying enough to make the sleepless nights and the anxiety worthwhile. And I started with my work, quietly reaching out to a few trusted colleagues who had started noticing irregularities themselves but had lacked proof, carefully guiding them to double-check contracts, account transfers, and client communications, while simultaneously monitoring Jake's attempts to manipulate situations and intercepting his moves before they could do any real damage. And at the same time, I secured my financial accounts, changed passwords, set up alerts, and moved sensitive investments into accounts only I could access, which made me feel a rush of power that I hadn't felt in months because suddenly, the life I thought he was hijacking was firmly back under my control. And then came the social manipulation, which was trickier but just as necessary, because Jake thrived on perception and half-truths, so I began planting seeds subtly, letting family and friends see minor inconsistencies in his stories, asking carefully worded questions in casual conversations that highlighted his selfishness, his lies, and his opportunism without ever making it obvious that I was orchestrating it. And the reactions were slow at first, an eyebrow raised here, a frown there, but by the end of the week, I noticed that his smug confidence was starting to wobble. That little nervous tics he had always hidden were peeking through when he thought no one was watching, and I couldn't help but smile at the tiny victories that confirmed my plan was working, while I continued to feed him just enough freedom to make him think he was still winning, which meant he didn't tighten security or watch me as closely, and that gave me the perfect opportunity to dig deeper, finding emails where he had promised clients the moon and failed to deliver, documents he had falsified to make himself look competent, and even small financial manipulations he thought no one would notice. And with each discovery, my plan expanded, because if I was going to bring him down, I wanted it to be absolute, irrefutable, and completely his own doing. And while I worked, I found unexpected allies, a mentor at work who had always admired my diligence, a friend who owed me a favor from a past project, and a colleague who had also been burned by Jake's charm and deceit. And with their help, I was able to create a web of evidence and social cues that would leave him exposed from every angle. And I started feeling something I hadn't felt in months: calm, methodical satisfaction. Because for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I wasn't reacting to chaos. I was orchestrating it, directing it with precision, and letting it flow toward a single, inevitable conclusion. And Jake, for all his cunning, didn't suspect a thing, which only fueled my confidence. Because the more he believed he was still in control, the faster his own house of cards would crumble. And then the moment came when I set the final pieces in motion. I leaked small, undeniable evidence of his financial fraud to the right people at work, arranged casual conversations where family members overheard him lying, and made sure clients received the real story of his manipulations, all without ever being directly tied to any of it. Because the beauty of this plan was that I was the puppeteer behind the curtain, unseen and untouchable, and I watched as the panic slowly crept into his eyes. Subtle at first, a missed phone call, a client questioning him, a parent frowning at his obvious lies, and then full-blown, as the walls closed in from every side, and the man who had thought he could destroy me without consequence was suddenly scrambling, frantically trying to cover his tracks, not realizing that I had anticipated every move. And while his panic escalated, I remained calm, confident, almost serene, because I knew exactly how this would end, and the thrill of control mixed with justice made my pulse race in a way that was both terrifying and intoxicating. And by the time he realized he was completely outmaneuvered, the damage was done. His credibility with clients was gone, his manipulation of family was exposed, and his every lie could be traced back to him. Yet I hadn't lifted a finger in anger, hadn't stooped to threats or intimidation. I had simply let him run his own race and stumble into the trap I had designed, and as I watched him falter, fumbling explanations and excuses, I felt the surge of satisfaction that comes from knowing someone who underestimated you is finally facing the consequences of their arrogance. And that's when I realized the most powerful part of this plan wasn't the exposure or the revenge. It was that I had taken control of my own life again, reclaiming my independence, my reputation, and my peace of mind. And as Jake stood there, frantic and bewildered, while I quietly observed the unfolding chaos, I knew that the next chapter of this story, the final act, was coming. And it would be the moment when every calculated step I had taken would culminate in the ultimate realization for him, that the sister he tried to destroy had not only survived, but outsmarted him completely. And in that quiet, victorious moment, I smiled, because I knew that karma, carefully planned and executed, was finally paying him back in full. The day it all came together was surreal, almost cinematic, like the kind of moment you read about in stories but never imagine living. And yet, there I was, 26, standing quietly in my apartment with my laptop open, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching as months of careful planning, patience, and strategy unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. Because every tiny move I had made, the subtle nudges with colleagues, the planted suspicions with family, the precise financial safeguards, and the secret documentation of Jake's lies, had created a perfect storm. And suddenly he was the one scrambling, the one trying desperately to control the narrative. And I could see it all in real time. Client emails being forwarded to me instead of him, colleagues questioning his competence openly during meetings, and even the quiet whispers from my parents as they finally realized that every time they had defended him, he had been manipulating them. All of it converging to strip him of the credibility, trust, and authority he had so arrogantly assumed was his by default. And the beauty of it, the part that made me almost giddy with satisfaction, was that I hadn't had to yell, threaten, or humiliate him publicly. It was all elegant, precise, like a chess game where the opponent thinks they're winning until they're checkmated in front of everyone. And as the cascade of exposure hit him, the clients pulling their accounts, colleagues questioning his ethics, the internal audit discovering the falsified documents, the subtle but unmistakable financial irregularities he thought he had hidden, I could feel the tension in the air, the panic radiating from him even though he tried to maintain his composure. And it was intoxicating because for once, the tables had turned so completely that he had no idea where the next blow would come from. And meanwhile, I was calm, collected, untouchable, quietly reclaiming everything he had tried to take from me. My professional reputation, my financial independence, my sense of safety, my confidence in my ability to handle any betrayal. And I even saw the moment he realized the extent of his defeat. The exact instant where the arrogant mask slipped and the desperation became visible in his eyes. And it was satisfying in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months because this wasn't about cruelty. It was about justice, about demonstrating that underestimation carries consequences and that cleverness paired with patience can outsmart arrogance and deceit. And as I watched him falter publicly, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come, how much strength I had discovered in myself while building the tools to protect and empower my own life. And yet, even in that moment of victory, there was a strange calmness, a reflective clarity that reminded me that revenge wasn't about lingering hatred or personal attacks. It was about restoring balance and reclaiming control. And so I allowed myself to feel pride, satisfaction, and the quiet thrill of watching karma unfold, all while remaining the composed, intelligent person I had always been. Because the best revenge, I realized, is not loud or petty. It's effective, elegant, and complete, leaving no doubt about who had the power and who had squandered it. And after the chaos of exposure settled, I reached out to my mentors, friends, and colleagues who had quietly supported me, reinforcing bonds that had been strained by Jake's manipulations, and even considered approaching my family with a measured conversation. Not to scold or berate, but to explain the full story calmly and factually, giving them the chance to understand and reflect, which felt empowering in itself because I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of wisdom, and in the aftermath, I sat alone into my apartment one evening, watching the city lights glimmer like tiny stars below, thinking about forgiveness, not as a gift to Jake, but as a boundary I set for myself, a recognition that I didn't have to carry the weight of resentment forever, that I could rebuild my life stronger, wiser, and free from the manipulation that had once threatened to derail me. And I smiled to myself, knowing that while Jake would remember this lesson, I would remember the strength it took to execute it, and that was a true reward. The knowledge that I had navigated betrayal, emerged victorious, and reclaimed my life with intelligence, composure, and grace. And as I finally closed my laptop, the weight lifted from my shoulders, I realized that this was not just an ending. It was a beginning, a chance to live fully on my own terms, knowing that I had protected myself, taken back everything that was mine, and left the person who had tried to destroy me to face the consequences of their choices, all without losing myself in the process. And that sense of ultimate control, justice, and personal empowerment was sweeter than any victory I had ever imagined. The end. My family exiled me from the family chat after I refused to fund my sister. Then they tried to steal $80,000 using my name, so I gave them a lesson. I never thought refusing my sister $5,000 would get me kicked out of my own family chat, but here we are, staring at the cold, glaring silence where my name used to be, replaced by the echoes of notifications I'll never see again. Let me back up, because if you think this is just about money, you're going to miss the whole picture. I'm Samuel, 30, living in the States, self-made, independent, and done playing the role of the family ATM, and my sister Vanessa, 24, has made it her full-time job to remind me of that fact every single week. It all started that Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed like a warning siren. A flood of messages in the family chat, mom, dad, Aunt Lisa, cousin Darren, and of course Vanessa, each one pinging my screen, making my blood pressure rise before I even read the first line. Vanessa had apparently accidentally booked a last-minute trip to Miami, because of course her life is an endless stream of luxurious getaways she never earns herself. And her rent was overdue, her car needed repairs, her new obsession with designer handbags was in full swing, and she was apparently out of options, which, in their collective eyes, automatically made me the solution. I dealt with this before, sure, gently declining, offering advice, maybe covering a small portion when I felt like it. But this time I had had enough. I wasn't just tired of being drained financially. I was sick of the disrespect, the assumption that because I have a steady income, my money exists purely for their indulgence. I scrolled through the chat, reading message after entitled message from Vanessa. Sam, please, I really need this. You know I wouldn't ask if it weren't serious. And the passive-aggressive interventions from mom. Samuel, you should help your sister, she's family. And dad chiming in like it was a moral imperative. She's your sister, son, just give her the money. And in that moment, a strange clarity hit me. I could see it all. The pattern, the subtle manipulations, the family hierarchy built on emotional blackmail and monetary control. And I realized I was the only one who had been blind to it for years. I typed back, careful, deliberate. I'm not sending Vanessa $5,000. She needs to take responsibility for her choices. I won't enable this anymore. Almost instantly, the chat exploded. Messages flew like darts, some angry, some shocked, some pleading. Vanessa, predictably, flipped first. You're ridiculous, Sam. How can you be so heartless? I can't believe this. Then came the guilt tripping. Mom and Dad, he's really being selfish. And the subtle threats. Don't forget what you owe us, Sam. I felt my chest tighten, but I held my ground, watching my refusal ignite a firestorm I had long anticipated but hadn't fully imagined. The conversation became a chaotic mess, with everyone taking sides or trying to manipulate me into submission. I didn't respond further. Instead, I went about my day, ignoring the pings that kept rolling in, until sometime later I noticed something strange. My name had disappeared from the chat entirely. Not muted, not hidden, exiled. Someone, probably mom or dad, had removed me. That digital expulsion stung worse than I expected. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about control, about letting me know in the most public, humiliating way possible that I no longer belonged, that my opinion and boundaries meant nothing. Sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone, I felt a cocktail of anger, disbelief, and, surprisingly, liberation. It was the first real stand I had ever made, and though it hurt, it also sparked something inside me. A recognition that I couldn't keep bending to their toxic cycles. Flashbacks of past emergencies rushed in. Countless times I had transferred money for Vanessa's whims, her spoiled tantrums, the silent judgment if I ever hesitated, the endless strings attached. And here I was, finally cutting it off, and they had the audacity to punish me for it. I knew this was going to escalate, that the exile was not an end, but the beginning of something bigger. But for now, I let myself feel it. Anger, disappointment, even a grim satisfaction. That night, as I scrolled through my notifications from other apps, I realized how alone this made me feel. How sharply it exposed the gap between who I was willing to be and who my family expected me to be. Yet, even with the sting of exclusion, a small, defiant smile crept onto my face. I had drawn a line in the sand, and for the first time in years, it was clear to everyone, including Vanessa, that I wasn't going to back down. I didn't know what their next move would be, but I was ready, for the first time, to meet it head on. And so, the chapter closed, not with reconciliation, but with a charged silence, one that spoke volumes. Samuel had finally stood up, and the family knew that crossing him wouldn't be as simple as before. That night, I lay in bed, thinking about boundaries, control, and self-respect, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about choosing myself over their entitlement. I knew Vanessa would push harder, my parents would press me, and the chat, our digital battleground, was far from over. But as I drifted off, I held on to one truth. I wasn't just saying no to $5,000, I was saying yes to myself, and that was worth every angry message they'd sent, every whisper of betrayal, and every ounce of discomfort I felt in that moment. And that, my friends, was how my family ultimatum began. A conflict that would spiral far beyond the digital walls of a group chat and into a storm that none of us could have predicted. They weren't just upset that I said no, they tried to steal 8-figure money using my name. And I had proof, clear as day, staring back at me from my bank alerts, emails, and the horrifying chain of transactions that had been attempted without my knowledge. I still remember the exact moment I realized what had happened. I was sipping my coffee, trying to shake off the sting of being exiled from the family chat, when a notification from my bank's fraud department pinged. My heart stopped before I could even breathe. Someone had tried to transfer $80,000 from my account to an unknown destination, using information that only someone with access to my personal life could know. My address, my account numbers, even the little security questions I had meticulously set up over the years. I sat there, frozen, the mug slipping from my hand onto the kitchen counter, spilling coffee like the slow burn of panic that spread through my chest. And then, almost immediately, rage. Rage at Vanessa, yes, but also at my parents, at the family I had thought I could trust, at the system of entitlement and expectation that had festered under their roof for years and now, literally, in their hands. I replayed every conversation in the family chat, every subtle guilt trip, every veiled comment about how I owed Vanessa, and suddenly the picture clicked into place. This wasn't just manipulation, this was criminal intent disguised as desperation. I went into full investigative mode, quietly tracking every email, alert, and notification, documenting timestamps, IP addresses, and suspicious activity, because the last thing I was going to do was confront them blindly. Every detail I uncovered made me angrier. How my sister had logged into my details through the shared family devices, how one of my cousins had forwarded sensitive emails thinking they were helping, how mom and dad had, at the very least, known about the plan and looked the other way. It was like peeling back a layer of their carefully constructed normalcy to reveal this rotten, entitlement-driven core that thought crossing legal lines for personal gain was acceptable. The betrayal cut deeper than I imagined. It wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about blood ties that apparently meant nothing when weighed against convenience and greed. I remember pacing my apartment, phone in one hand, laptop open, coffee long forgotten, my mind racing through every possible outcome. Could I go to the police immediately? Should I confront them first? What if they lied, denied everything, and tried to gaslight me into silence? The ethical and strategic calculations were exhausting, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I started by setting up a detailed record of every suspicious activity, every attempt to breach my accounts, screenshots, emails, dates, times, even cross-referencing IP addresses to pinpoint who had been involved. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just Vanessa acting alone. This was a web of family enabling, a tacit agreement that my money was fair game, and that my boundaries didn't matter. I couldn't believe how casually they crossed a line that could have ruined me financially in seconds. Yet, at the same time, a cold, precise clarity started to form in my mind. The kind of focus that comes when you're hurt, betrayed, but determined to win. I devised a strategy to protect myself legally first, freezing suspicious transfers, changing passwords, alerting my bank, and even involving fraud prevention specialists to monitor every account. All the while, I remained calm on the surface, not giving them the satisfaction of seeing me panic, because I knew that the real power lay in preparation and patience. And patience became my ally as I continued to observe, collect evidence, and trace the digital footprints, noting Vanessa's patterns of manipulation, the way she tried to cover tracks, and the subtle ways my parents attempted to normalize her actions after the fact. There were moments where anger boiled over, moments where I imagined confronting them outright and letting the fury of betrayal explode. But I restrained myself. That wasn't the point. The point was justice. And justice, I realized, required patience, meticulous planning, and the element of surprise. I started to see the layers of deceit. My parents' attempts to guilt me into compliance were not just emotional manipulation, they were part of a larger system that allowed Vanessa to act without consequence. Every family dinner, every casual mention of her needs, every reminder of what I supposedly owed her, all of it was now reframed in my mind as a rehearsal for the day they thought they could steal from me. And I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of exhilaration beneath the anger. Finally, I had clarity. Finally, I understood the full scale of the betrayal, and for the first time in years, I felt in control in a way I never had when they were kind of manipulating me. I documented everything in detail, creating a chronological record of communications, chat history, attempted transfers, suspicious IPs, and emails. All the proof I would need to confront them decisively when the time came. I also started to test boundaries, dropping subtle hints to see who was complicit, who would react defensively, and who would try to cover up. Vanessa, predictably, responded with indignation and denial, masking her anxiety with anger, while Mom and Dad oscillated between concern and thinly veiled panic whenever I mentioned the attempted fraud, their moral high ground slipping further with every question I asked. It was fascinating to watch from a psychological perspective how entitled people react when their schemes are exposed even partially. They panic, rationalize, and lash out. I realized that while anger was natural, it was control that would win me the day. And I began to formulate a plan not just to recover the money and protect myself, but to ensure that Vanessa, and by extension, the rest of my family, would never again feel entitled to manipulate or endanger me. And so, in the quiet moments between alert notifications and careful investigation, I sat down with a notebook, pen in hand, detailing every move, every lesson I wanted them to learn, and the eventual payoff for myself. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but a calculated assertion of boundaries, power, and respect. The betrayal had cut deep, but it also ignited a fire, the kind that burns slow and steady, not wildly and destructively. By the end of the week, I wasn't just recovering from shock. I was actively strategizing, mentally rehearsing confrontations, contingency plans, and legal steps, all while maintaining the guise of calm in daily life. I had crossed from disbelief into focused action, and every time my phone buzzed with another message from Vanessa, another guilt-laden or outraged comment from my parents, I reminded myself that this was their choice, their moral failing, and my role now was simple: protect myself, expose the truth, and teach them that crossing me carried consequences. And that, my friends, is the point where the family I once trusted ceased to be simply annoying or entitled. They became a clear and present danger, and I knew that if I didn't act carefully, the betrayal could have far-reaching consequences. But now I was awake, alert, and ready, and the lesson they were about to learn was going to be unforgettable, because no amount of guilt-tripping, chat manipulation, or familial expectation was going to stop me from reclaiming my life, my money, and my dignity. The betrayal had set the stage for a showdown that none of us could yet predict, and I had a front row seat to watch the tension build while I quietly prepared to strike, knowing that patience evidence, and precision would be my ultimate weapons against a family that thought they could steal from me and get away with it. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to fight, I was going to let them dig their own grave, and I'd be watching every step. But before I go further, know this. The plan wasn't born out of spite, so much as exhaustion and an aching desire to close a chapter of my life that had been propped open by other people's entitlement for far too long. After the fraud alert and the cold realization that my family had proved themselves willing to use my name to try to siphon $80,000 out of my account, something in me changed from reactive to surgical. I spent the first 48 hours after the discovery doing the obvious things: freezing accounts, calling fraud departments, installing extra monitoring, and hiring a lawyer to get the legal scaffolding in place. But the real work was quieter and slower. It was a chess game of influence, evidence, and patience. I wrote everything down on one big legal pad: dates, times, snippets of messages, screenshots, IP traces, the names of family members who could plausibly have accessed certain devices, and the small habits Vanessa had that pointed to the way she tried to cover tracks. Doing that list felt almost ritualistic, like clearing the fog in the room so I could see clearly which pieces moved and which were nailed to the floor. Once my defenses were up, my energy turned toward offense, but not the kind of petty, messy revenge you see in movies. I wanted a lesson that would land so precisely it would be impossible to misinterpret. Boundaries are real. There are consequences when you cross legal lines, and I will not be complicit in your moral bankruptcy. I mapped out 3 complementary tracks: legal pressure, social exposure, and psychological leverage. The legal track was straightforward: evidence collection, formal complaints, and contingency plans to escalate to law enforcement if necessary. My lawyer, an efficient woman named Priya, who had a reputation for cutting through the theatrics to the cold facts, helped me frame everything in an airtight way. We documented the attempted transfers, the suspicious logins, and I gave her a timeline of the family chat manipulation. She advised calm and precision. No public accusations without proof, no premature threats that could be used against me. That advice became the backbone of the plan. Be composed, be documented, and let the evidence do the talking. The social exposure track required a different touch. I wasn't interested in humiliating my parents on social media or staging a public spectacle, petty and damaging to everyone involved, but I wanted to create consequences that mattered to them. The withdrawal of the privilege they'd always enjoyed of treating me like an inexhaustible safety net. To do that, I started building a slow, inevitable narrative that would culminate in them facing the very real friends and those who had benefited from the family's reputation. I quietly reached out to a handful of relatives whom I trusted, or at least suspected, wouldn't reflexively side with Vanessa. I didn't tell them everything. I asked questions instead, planting seeds and watching where the water pooled, because the way people react under pressure tells you more than what they say when everything is fine. The psychological leverage was, if anything, the darkest part of the plan to anyone watching from the outside. It was simply about letting them expose themselves through their own reactions. People who operate by emotional blackmail rely on a few predictabilities: guilt, panic, quick fixes, and once their toolkit is understood, those tools turn against them. For example, when someone tries to shame you into paying for their mistakes, their first instinct is to turn the moral tables. You owe us, they say, or family comes first. So I made a point of being unswayed by guilt. I replied sparingly, always measured, never defending myself in the heat of an argument, because defense fuels drama, drama fuels sympathy, and sympathy diffuses consequence. Instead, I let the questions hang. Why were you using my name? Who told you my account details? Who else was aware? Those questions forced them to account for their actions in the quiet. And in the quiet, people are most honest, or most panicked. I also engineered small, controlled reveals. I didn't broadcast accusations. I let them discover that I had access to information they assumed I'd never have. Bank alerts, timestamps, and even anonymized IP locations that pointed to devices on which family members had been active. The realization that I had evidence didn't make them confess, it made them flail, which is almost better for my purposes. While I wasn't the sort to play mind games for sport, there is an undeniable satisfaction in watching someone built on entitlement realize that the scaffolding is gone. Importantly, every step I took was legal and ethical. I never hacked devices, never impersonated anyone, and never did anything that would give them legitimate grounds to paint me as a hostile actor. When you're building a case, especially against people to whom you're related, the last thing you need is your morality to be compromised because you wanted to win at any cost. I'd learned that the hard way in my 20s. Winning but dragging yourself through mud feels hollow. This, then, was careful. It was about making their choices have natural consequences. The first tactical move that produced results was the way I used the family chat against them. After being expelled, I didn't beg to be let back in. Instead, I saved a copy of the chat and its metadata and had Priya draft a sternly worded letter to my parents, sent via certified mail, explaining that an unauthorized attempt to transfer funds from my account had been traced and that I was compiling evidence for potential legal action. The letter wasn't accusatory in tone, it was clinical, enumerating facts and requesting an explanation. That note landed with more force than any emotional appeal because it implied formal escalation. Within 24 hours of receiving the letter, the tone from mom and dad shifted from moral superiority to frantic damage control. They called me, twice, in controlled bursts, mom's voice quivery, dad's brusque but defensive, and I let them stumble through explanations, capturing every word. People who are confronted with something that threatens a long-standing narrative will often reveal more than they intend when pressed with a composed, factual presence. I let them talk, and I documented it. Meanwhile, Vanessa's behavior was a fascinating blend of defiance and sloppy cover-up. She doubled down publicly in messages to mutual acquaintances, stories about how I'd become cold and how family was being unfair. But privately, she made two big mistakes that opened a crack wide enough for me to slide in. First, she used a shared family device, an old tablet we all use for streaming, without logging out of the family's autofill for certain emails. Second, she confided in a cousin who'd always leaned on her for gossip and who, cornered by a few pointed questions from me, accidentally forwarded a screenshot that corroborated a timestamped login. I am not proud of the glee I felt when that screenshot arrived in my inbox. It was proof that tied a suspicious IP and timestamp to a device that, yes, Vanessa had used. Priya advised caution. Don't broadcast a screenshot, preserve it, chain it to the other evidence, and let the pattern become undeniable, which is exactly what we did. Once we had enough to show not just an attempt, but a coordinated series of suspicious actions, Priya drafted a follow-up to law enforcement and arranged for a meeting at the fraud division of my bank. Let me be clear, this was not the dramatic, I'm calling the police moment you see on TV. It was a meticulous presentation of documents, the family chat record, bank alerts, timestamps, the IP logs, the screenshot from the shared device, and notes from phone calls where my parents' language betrayed knowledge and complicity. The bank's fraud team was thorough and professional. They placed additional holds, pushed for a formal investigation, and froze any transfers out of my linked accounts until the matter was resolved. That move alone made the family panic visibly. You haven't truly seen entitlement squirm until you've watched someone whose comfort depends on liquid access to money confronted with the reality that the taps have been shut. The next phase of my plan was psychological and aimed at reality testing their claims of innocence. I started arranging small interactions designed to force their hand. I called Vanessa to ask a mundane question about a childhood memory we shared, then listened intently for her responses, timing them, watching her vocal cadence for signs of stress. I sent neutral texts to mom and dad that sounded casual but were actually probes. Little things like, did you see the email from the bank? Or who used the living room tablet last weekend? And I watched how they deflected, how quickly they provided detail, or how they vanished into silence. The people who were directly or indirectly involved gave themselves away in those moments. The ones who tried to cover up were evasive. The ones who weren't involved either ignored or expressed genuine shock. Those patterns fed into the dossier Priya and I were building. Meanwhile, I safeguarded my life practically. New passwords, two-factor authentication on everything, moving liquid assets into accounts only I controlled, and transferring a chunk of money into a fiduciary account that required two forms of ID and an in-person visit to access. Protecting my finances was boring work, but it gave me back a sense of agency that the betrayal had stolen. There was an emotional cost to all of this. I won't lie and say I wasn't wounded. My parents, people who'd held me in their arms as a kid and who I trusted implicitly, had permitted or at least not prevented a scheme that could have ruined me. At night, I found myself replaying their faces, searching for the moments they might have made a different choice, and feeling a complicated mixture of grief and righteous anger. That grief was real. It's a strange thing to realize that your family's definition of family is conditional, and that loyalty can be wielded as a weapon. But grief can be useful fuel if you channel it. It sharpened my resolve and made me ruthless in the way I pursued facts without becoming cruel in the way I used them. At the same time, a small, stubborn part of me wanted them to see the error of their ways and change, to want a genuine, remorseful repair. So part of the strategy always left a path for them to do the right thing. I never wanted to destroy the family. I wanted to remove myself from the corrosive orbit where they could treat me as a resource rather than a person. And so every formal move, every fax letter, every police report draft, every bank meeting was accompanied by an invitation to dialogue framed in terms of responsibility. Here are the facts. Here are the consequences if no remediation happens. Here is how you make this right. It was a strange, clinical way of forcing morality, but in some ways it's kinder than letting toxic behavior continue unchecked. As the fabric of their defenses frayed, their reactions became more telling. Vanessa lashed out on social media and public forums where we had mutual friends trying to paint herself as the victim. Mom tried to rally family by telling a sanitized version of events in group texts. Dad grumbled and accused me of making mountains out of molehills. But when cousin Darren, who'd always been somewhat neutral, sent me a long private message admitting he'd felt uncomfortable about the way things had been handled and apologizing for his part in forwarding sensitive info, I knew the tide was turning. Those little cracks were everything. Every family has those loose, unnoticed pieces of honesty. And once one person starts to acknowledge it, others follow. The real turning point came on a humid Friday afternoon when Priya suggested a calibrated reveal. Nothing public, nothing humiliating. Just an arranged meeting with mom and dad where I'd lay out the evidence calmly and give them a narrow window to make amends before we move forward with formal charges. Priya handled the legal framework, but emotionally, I prepared myself for whatever would happen. I wrote down what I'd say, rehearsed it until the edges were smooth, and then showed up with a dossier and a curious sort of peace. The meeting was tense, my parents' faces a mixture of incredulity and panic. But when I pulled open the folder and began to speak, reading facts and timestamps while keeping my voice even, the air in the room changed. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I presented. That calmness was, perhaps, the cruelest mercy. You could see the realization unfold across their faces. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a boundary with teeth, and I wasn't bluffing. Mom started to cry. Dad got angry. Vanessa tried to deflect, but the evidence didn't care about their theatrics. I gave them a choice. Cooperate now, help make this right, or face a legal process that would be far more public and far less forgiving. It was a hard thing to do, but it was honest, and it was, importantly, fair. They were offered opportunity and consequences in equal measure. In the days that followed, small attempts at remediation came, some sincere, some clumsy. Vanessa offered to return an amount she didn't have and admitted that she'd been part of the scheme. Dad pledged to sell a family heirloom to compensate, and Mom wrote an apologetic message that was half heartfelt, half self-defense. None of that erased the betrayal, but it did change the calculus. They had a path off the ledge if they took it, and if they didn't, I was prepared to let the legal system take its course. By the time the week closed, the plan had done what I'd hoped. It had stopped the immediate financial threat, put pressure on those who were complicit, and forced honest conversations that had been avoided for years. More importantly, it taught me something about myself. I could be principled and pragmatic at once. I could protect my assets and my dignity without becoming monstrous, and I could draw a line that, once crossed, demanded accountability. The lesson wasn't just for them, it was for me too. Never again would I allow my sense of familial obligation to be used as an excuse for exploitation. They dug, and I watched. And when their shovel hit the brittle layer of consequence, it crumbled under them, leaving a space I could stand in without guilt. The plan, methodical, patient, and merciful in its own way, had worked better than I could have dared hope. And as the dust settled, I understood that revenge would have been empty, but justice, calibrated and humane, felt like reclamation. When I finally showed them the proof, the silence in the room wasn't just awkward. It was terrifying. A heavy, suffocating pause that seemed to stretch out for an eternity. And in that silence, every lie, every manipulation, every ounce of entitlement my family had ever leaned on came crashing down in a way that words alone could never have conveyed. The day started innocuously enough, or at least it looked that way on the surface. I invited Mom, Dad, and Vanessa to my apartment under the guise of a casual family discussion. Something that seemed routine, nothing threatening, but my mind had been rehearsing this for weeks. Every detail planned, every word, every subtle movement calibrated to make the truth land like a hammer. I had the evidence laid out before me in neat folders, digital files on my laptop, printouts, timestamps, screenshots, everything that connected Vanessa to the attempted $80,000 transfer and highlighted the complicity, ignorance, or deliberate inaction of Mom and Dad. I didn't want theatrics. I didn't want a screaming match. I wanted controlled, undeniable confrontation, and I knew the power of calm. I opened with small, almost mundane details, things that seemed harmless. Remember that tablet in the living room? I checked the login history, and I watched the way Vanessa's hand twitched, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the moment she realized I wasn't bluffing. I didn't pause. I moved seamlessly into timelines, IP addresses, the specific attempts to access my accounts, each fact delivered with precision and without emotion, letting the cold logic speak louder than outrage ever could. Mom tried the classic pivot to guilt, voice quivering, eyes pleading. Samuel, I didn't know. I swear you're overreacting. It's just Vanessa. And I didn't respond immediately. Silence. The pause did the work better than words ever could. Dad, meanwhile, leaned forward, arms crossed, his usual defensive stance, muttering something about overreaction. But the evidence sat there, immovable, concrete, and it didn't care what he thought. Vanessa, however, couldn't maintain her composure. She started speaking quickly, nervously, trying to rationalize, deflect, apologize, and lie all at once. And the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had no plan to deny anything convincingly. Each statement she made only reinforced the evidence I had, and I didn't interrupt. I let her dig her own hole deeper while I silently cataloged her reactions. Knowing every slip, every hesitated phrase, every contradiction mattered. The moment crystallized when I displayed the printouts, logins from the tablet, emails forwarded without authorization, timestamps matching attempts to siphon the money, and a screenshot from the cousin that confirmed collusion or at least awareness. I could see the air change in the room. Mom's shoulders slumped, Dad's face paled, and Vanessa's eyes darted, finally landing on me with a mixture of fear, shame, and disbelief. "You see this?" I said softly, not angrily, and the weight of the question hung there. "This isn't opinion. This isn't interpretation. This is fact. And because of this, there are consequences you can no longer ignore." I let it sink in, giving them space to breathe it, let it roll around in their heads. The psychological effect was immediate and brutal. Vanessa shrank in her seat, biting her lip, fidgeting, trying to regain control where none existed. Mom tried to interrupt, attempting to rationalize or apologize prematurely, and Dad's defensive edge turned into visible panic as the enormity of the situation hit him. Then I laid out the legal safeguards: frozen accounts, pending fraud investigations, the possibility of escalation if corrective actions weren't taken. I was calm, deliberate, and precise, and that calmness amplified the tension. Nobody expected measured authority from me. They expected outrage, begging, or compromise, and instead I gave them accountability. I even allowed a small, tactical, psychological lever. I paused and looked at each of them in turn, letting the weight of expectation, responsibility, and shame press down without saying a single word, because sometimes the unspoken message carries more force than any verbal accusation. You were wrong, and you must make it right. Vanessa finally whispered an apology, broken, disjointed, but genuine enough for me to note the difference between panic and acknowledgement. Mom, still teary-eyed, tried to rationalize her behavior, but the evidence, the clear timeline, and the potential legal ramifications muted every word before it could land. Dad, who had always considered himself the ultimate arbiter of reason, sat frozen, arms crossed, jaw tight, realizing that control was no longer his. The room was tense, fragile, and electric, but I maintained composure because in that moment, control was power, and I had it completely. I outlined the path forward. Vanessa would compensate, partial repayment immediately, counseling for financial responsibility, and a full discussion with the extended family about boundaries and expectations. Mom and Dad would formally acknowledge their failure to safeguard my trust and privacy and would participate in corrective measures. Every detail was negotiated, not out of malice, but out of necessity, and I watched as the family, long accustomed to entitlement and manipulation, wrestled with the reality that nothing in that room could undo the facts, the evidence, or my resolve. Over the course of several hours, the confrontation unfolded like a carefully orchestrated play, each act revealing more of the truth. Vanessa's missteps, Mom and Dad's enabling, and the fractured moral compass that had allowed it all. There were moments of raw emotion, anger flaring briefly from Vanessa, tears from Mom, frustration from Dad, and yet I remained the eye of the storm, silent, observant, in control, letting each action and reaction reinforce the point I had been making for weeks. Consequences exist, and they're unavoidable when you cross the line. By the end, the air had changed. The family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. There was no dramatic shouting, no catastrophic outbursts, just the sober, unavoidable recognition that they had been caught, accountable, and that I had set the terms. I didn't feel triumphant in a petty sense. I felt justice, measured, precise, and earned. For the first time in years, they saw me not as the indulgent brother, the passive son, the ever-available resource, but as a person with boundaries, agency, and the ability to enforce both. I let the room settle in that silence, observing their reactions, internalizing their shame, and feeling the strange, bittersweet clarity that comes when confrontation is over and the truth is undeniable. That day, I didn't just expose a scheme, I redefined the rules of engagement for my entire family, demonstrating that entitlement has limits, that deception carries consequences, and that calm, calculated action always outperforms rage or panic. And as I watched Vanessa shrink, Mom look stunned, and Dad slump into quiet reflection, I realized that the confrontation wasn't the end. It was the pivot, the fulcrum on which the rest of our lives would now turn, a lesson burned into the very fabric of our relationships that they wouldn't forget, and one that marked the beginning of a new chapter where I would never again be treated as anything less than an equal, autonomous person, fully in control of my own life, my finances, and my dignity. I didn't just teach them a lesson. They learned that I'm not the same person they could manipulate anymore. And some things money can't fix. And as I sit back and reflect on the weeks, months, and the emotional fallout since the confrontation, I realize how profoundly everything has shifted, not just in my family, but in myself. Because what started as a battle over $80,000 became a war for my autonomy, my dignity, and my understanding of what it means to truly set boundaries and protect myself. And the first, most obvious change was in Vanessa, whose fiery sense of entitlement had been thoroughly tempered by reality. She faced serious consequences, repayment plans, oversight on her finances, mandatory financial counseling, and a network of accountability that she had never experienced before, and watching her squirm through it all was strangely satisfying. Not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because it was the only way to make her understand that recklessness and manipulation come with real costs, that the world isn't an extension of her convenience, and that no amount of charm or guilt tripping could override responsibility. And as she slowly confronted her own mistakes, apologizing awkwardly, sometimes sincerely, to me and even to others she had implicated, I saw the beginnings of a shift, a sliver of humility that had been absent for years. Though, of course, this was only partial and fragile. Change never comes all at once. And it was my role to enforce the structure around that growth, not to coddle it, because boundaries are only meaningful when consistently respected. And while Vanessa struggled with this new reality, mom and dad had their own reckonings, which were more complex because their betrayal had been less direct but no less damaging. And they oscillated between guilt, defensiveness, and attempts to regain their moral high ground, but nothing could erase the evidence. The meetings with the bank, the meticulous documentation, or the reminder that I had control over the narrative now. And in watching them navigate this new terrain, I learned something unexpected. Sometimes people can't change fully. Sometimes they will stumble, rationalize, or regress. And my task wasn't to fix them, but to protect myself while giving them the space to adjust to the consequences of their own actions, which itself was a lesson in patience, empathy, and emotional self-preservation that I hadn't fully appreciated before. And in the quiet mornings afterward, I would reflect on how far I had come, realizing that this ordeal had forced me to define what I would and wouldn't tolerate in any relationship, family, or otherwise. And that power, when wielded carefully and ethically, could reclaim spaces that had been occupied by manipulation, coercion, or entitlement for decades. And as the dust settled, I reclaimed routines and independence that had been quietly eroded over time. My finances were secure, my privacy intact, my personal and professional life uninterrupted, and the subtle, almost imperceptible weight of anxiety that had accompanied every family interaction lifted in a way that made the air feel lighter, freer, almost intoxicating in its simplicity. And in this new clarity, I also realized the importance of measuring generosity, of knowing when to say no, and the kind of moral courage it takes to act in accordance with your principles even when it angers those closest to you. Because love and loyalty do not require you to be endlessly exploitable, and protecting yourself is not betrayal, it is preservation. And that preservation became the foundation of my new reality. A reality where I could interact with my family on my own terms, where calls and messages were no longer sources of dread, where shared meals or gatherings no longer carried the silent threat of entitlement, and instead, each encounter was a choice rather than an obligation. And that choice carried power, responsibility, and dignity, which I had reclaimed in full. And yet, amidst all of this, I couldn't ignore the bittersweet truth that relationships aren't always fully repairable. That trust, once broken, leaves a scar even when the surface is healed, and that some lessons are learned at a cost, emotional or otherwise, that no repayment or apology can fully erase. And I accepted that because what mattered most wasn't revenge, or even restitution, but clarity, boundaries, and the knowledge that I had taken control of my life, stood firm in the face of betrayal, and emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably principled. And in this understanding, I finally felt the satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing, not for show, not for approval, but for yourself. And as I watched Vanessa, mom, and dad adjust, sometimes clumsily, sometimes sincerely, I realized that I had given them the opportunity to grow under pressure, to confront consequences, and perhaps even to learn humility. But I also learned that my growth was the truest triumph because it was independent of their choices. And it was in that triumph, quiet but profound, that I found peace, dignity, and the unmistakable clarity that no one, not even family, could ever again manipulate me or take for granted what I had worked so hard to build. And the lesson that had begun as financial betrayal became, in the end, the defining moment of my life. The day I realized that self-respect, boundaries, and calculated action are worth far more than money, that they are armor against entitlement and deceit, and that standing firm, even in the face of those you love, is sometimes the most compassionate and powerful act of all. And as the weeks rolled into months, as Vanessa complied with the repayment plans and therapy, as mom and dad adjusted to their new reality and the limits of their influence over me, I settled into a rhythm of life that felt authentically mine, free of guilt, free of manipulation, and entirely under my control. And in that rhythm, I understood a final truth. Money can be stolen, manipulated, or misused, but integrity, agency, and self-respect are priceless, and nothing, not entitlement, not guilt-tripping, not even familial expectation, can take them from you if you refuse to give them up. And that is the lesson I carried forward, not just for myself, but as a silent testament to the family who tried to exploit me. I survived, I reclaimed what was mine, and I would never again be anyone's puppet, because some lines, once drawn and enforced, protect more than your finances. They protect your soul. The end. My college bully became famous, but karma caught up. I never thought my first year of college would feel like living in a nightmare, but looking back now, it's clear that it was the moment my life quietly split into before Carson and after Carson. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and all I wanted was to disappear into my books, my assignments, and the quiet corners of the library where no one would notice me. I had grown up in a small town in the Midwest, always a little timid, a little too careful, and college felt like the chance to start fresh, to reinvent myself without the echoes of my past mistakes shadowing every step. And then there was Carson. Handsome, effortlessly charming, the kind of person who could make a room stop and look when he walked in, the kind of person teachers praised for leadership potential, and classmates gawked at like he was untouchable. On the first day, I remember him laughing with his friends near the quad, tossing his backpack over one shoulder, smiling in a way that made it seem like the world revolved around him. I didn't think much of him at first. I assumed popularity was harmless, even enviable, but that assumption evaporated the second he opened his mouth and made me the target of his amusement. It started small. Snide comments in passing, subtle jabs that I thought maybe I had misheard, but it had escalated so quickly that by the end of the first week, I realized he had set his sights on me. And the world was just a stage for his cruelty. He would accidentally bump into me in the cafeteria, spilling my coffee and laughing so loudly it drew attention, and I could see people snickering behind their hands. He left notes in my locker with mocking messages about my hair, my clothes, even my timid way of walking across campus, and the worst part was the way he twisted my own words into jokes he would tell to anyone within earshot, leaving me feeling exposed and humiliated as though I had no safe place to retreat. I tried telling myself that it was just the usual college hazing, a rite of passage for someone like me who didn't fit into the loud, self-assured mold of the student body. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal and it was relentless. I started avoiding classes where I knew he would be, rearranging my schedule to dodge him, and yet no matter where I went, there he was. Always grinning, always whispering to someone just as I passed by, always making it clear that he could ruin my day with a single word. I remember one moment in particular during my first biology lab that cut deeper than anything else. I had spent hours preparing for the presentation, meticulously practicing my lines in front of the mirror, feeling a rare spark of pride that maybe I could hold my own for once. And then Carson raised his hand during my turn and asked a question so pointed, so intentionally designed to make me stumble that I could feel my cheeks flush and my throat tighten as I faltered in front of the entire class. The laughter that followed was a mix of cruel amusement and social obligation, the kind that makes you want to vanish, and I wanted to crawl under the table and disappear into the linoleum floor. What hurt the most wasn't the humiliation itself, but the way people whispered about it afterwards. The way they looked at me like I had done something wrong by simply existing in a space that Carson had deemed his own. It was exhausting, and it chipped away at my confidence in ways I didn't understand at the time, leaving me feeling isolated and unseen, yet paradoxically hypervisible in all the ways I hated. And yet, even in that suffocating haze, I began to notice cracks in Carson's charm. Fleeting moments when his arrogance slipped and the people around him hesitated to laugh or exchange glances that seemed to question his charisma. There was a quiet, observant student named Lila in my philosophy class who, after witnessing one of his cruel jabs, gave me a small, sympathetic nod, a subtle acknowledgement that not everyone was blind to the ugliness he carried behind his smile. I clung to those moments, those small sparks of recognition, as proof that the world wasn't entirely his stage, that not everyone would automatically bow to him. But nothing prepared me for the defining moment that would stick with me, sear itself into my memory, and awaken a determination I didn't know I had. It was during the fall formal, a supposedly fun, harmless night meant for dancing and socializing, when Carson decided to orchestrate the ultimate humiliation. I had reluctantly agreed to go after much internal debate, thinking maybe I could blend in, maybe I could prove to myself that I was stronger than the anxiety that clung to me like a second skin. I was wearing a simple dress I had loved, hair carefully curled, and I had even managed a tentative smile as I walked into the crowded gymnasium. And there he was, leaning against the wall with his entourage, scanning the room with that predatory charm. And when our eyes met, I could see the calculation behind his smile. He waited until everyone was on the dance floor, then loudly commented on my outfit, making an exaggerated joke about how someone must have raided the thrift shop aisle for this one, and then proceeded to invite a few people over to mock me further, orchestrating a scene so humiliating that I wanted to melt into the floor and disappear entirely. People laughed, some awkwardly, some cruelly, and I felt the sting of betrayal from those who didn't step in, didn't defend me, didn't even glance in my direction with sympathy. And yet, in that moment, as my tears blurred the flashing lights of the dance floor, something shifted inside me. The humiliation, the helplessness, the suffocating embarrassment, it all ignited a fire. A quiet but furious determination that I would never allow someone like Carson to hold that kind of power over me again. I left the dance floor in a blur, but instead of hiding in my dorm room, I found myself walking alone under the crisp night air, the lights of campus reflecting in puddles. And for the first time, I made a promise to myself that this wouldn't define me, that one day I would be the one smiling while he faced the consequences of his arrogance. The days that followed were still hard, filled with awkward encounters, whispered rumors, and the constant anxiety that came with navigating a world where someone like Carson seemed untouchable. But I began to notice patterns, small opportunities, and weaknesses in his carefully crafted persona. I learned to observe him, to understand how he manipulated situations, how he relied on fear and charm rather than genuine substance, and I started to quietly plan in my mind, not with malice, at least not yet, but with a sense of strategic patience that would one day tip the scales in my favor. By the end of that semester, I was still timid, still careful, but no longer powerless. The fire he had ignited that night at the dance didn't just burn away my fear. It forged a new version of me, one that watched, calculated, and waited. And though I couldn't see the path ahead clearly, I knew one thing for certain. The shadows of college, the cruelty I endured, and the relentless power of a bully like Carson would not break me. They would, in time, teach me how to rise above him. And in the quiet recesses of my mind, I began to dream of a day when karma, in its own way, would catch up. 7 years had passed since that humiliating night at the fall formal. And if someone had told me back then that I would end up where I am now, I'm not sure I would have believed them. At 25, I had carved out a life that was quietly fulfilling, stable, professional, and free from the kind of relentless social anxiety that had dominated my first years in college. I worked at a mid-sized tech firm in Boston, a position that paid well, offered security, and allowed me the kind of independence I'd craved ever since my freshman year. My apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with books I loved, plants I had somehow kept alive against all odds, and the faint scent of coffee that lingered every morning when I made my way to the window to watch the city wake. I was no longer the timid girl who shrank in corners and avoided eye contact. I carried myself with a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need loud declarations or the approval of strangers to feel validated. And yet, despite the stability I had worked so hard to build, there was one thing that still rattled me every time I saw it. Carson. Or, more accurately, the person Carson had become, or claimed to be, online. Social media had changed everything. One night, scrolling through my feed after a long day at work, I stumbled upon his profile, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. The same cocky smile, the same perfectly coiffed hair, the same brand of arrogance I had spent so many years learning to outrun, now broadcast to millions of followers who adored him for reasons I still couldn't quite comprehend. He had become a full-blown influencer, flashing luxury cars, extravagant vacations, and a lifestyle so over the top it bordered on absurd, yet somehow people bought into it completely. He had turned charm into currency, manipulating the spotlight, the same way he had manipulated our classmates years ago. And it was impossible not to feel a pang of old resentment mixed with a grudging fascination at the skill with which he had reinvented himself. The more I watched his stories, the more I noticed patterns that reminded me of his college persona. The way he laughed at things that weren't funny, the way he subtly put people down under the guise of jokes, the way he curated his image so meticulously that no one could see the cracks unless they looked closely. I found myself scrolling late into the night, alternately disgusted and intrigued, realizing that I had a front row seat to a carefully staged life that wasn't as perfect as it seemed. A few encounters with mutual acquaintance confirmed my suspicions. I ran into Jenna, a girl who had been in our economics class, at a work conference in New York, and over drinks, she casually dropped stories about Carson that made my stomach twist. Apparently, behind the glossy Instagram photos and viral videos, he had left a trail of bad business deals, shallow friendships, and more than one hurt reputation in his wake. People were afraid to speak up publicly, but whispers circulated in private circles, and I began to piece together a version of Carson that was human, flawed, and, most importantly, vulnerable in ways he never let the world see. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. For a moment, I caught myself imagining what it would feel like to confront him directly, to call him out on all the lies, all the bravado, all the cruelty he had managed to disguise as charm. But I also knew better than to act impulsively. 7 years of living my own life had taught me patience, strategy, and the value of waiting for the right moment. I began to observe him more deliberately, noting the subtle inconsistencies in his posts, the way he reacted when challenged, the friends who seemed loyal in photos but, according to Jenna, were quick to distance themselves when things went south. I realized that his empire was built on perception, not substance, and that gave me a dangerous kind of hope. I also saw myself reflected in ways I hadn't expected. I had spent years healing, building, and growing into a version of myself that Carson would never have predicted. A woman who could navigate life independently, who could recognize manipulation from a mile away, and who could quietly plan without anyone knowing her intentions. And yet, I couldn't ignore the way my chest tightened every time I saw his smug grin. a reminder that the past wasn't completely behind me, that some wounds take years to fade but never fully disappear. One evening, while attending a networking event for my company, I overheard a conversation about Carson's latest collaboration, a high-profile sponsorship deal that had fallen apart because of his own recklessness. Apparently, he had mismanaged funds, burned bridges with key partners, and left people scrambling to fix the mess while keeping up appearances. I felt a jolt of satisfaction that I couldn't fully explain, a flicker of validation that maybe life had a way of balancing the scales, even if slowly and quietly. It was in that moment that the idea began to form, subtle at first, like a shadow creeping along the edges of my mind. What if I could do more than just watch? What if I could take the knowledge I had, the patience I had cultivated, and the insights I had gained from years of observing him, and use them to dismantle the illusion he had built? Not out of malice, but out of justice, maybe even a little poetic karma. I started jotting notes on my phone, keeping track of patterns, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities in his public persona, all the while maintaining my own carefully curated life offline. I reached out to a few contacts who had dealt with him professionally, asking casual questions, listening more than I spoke, and slowly, like pieces of a puzzle coming together, the picture of Carson as a man who could charm but not sustain, who could dazzle but not deliver, began to emerge. And with each revelation, my resolve strengthened. I could feel the shift happening inside me, the same fire that had been ignited on the dance floor years ago, only now tempered with strategy, patience, and confidence. It was exhilarating to realize that the power dynamic had changed. I was no longer the timid girl shrinking in the shadows, waiting for humiliation to strike. I was a woman who had lived, learned, and grown, and who had the tools to expose the truth without stooping to the cruelty that had once defined him. Nights were spent researching, analyzing, and quietly plotting, not with vengeance in mind, but with a desire to see the facade crumble on its own weight, to see him face the consequences of his arrogance in a way that was undeniable and visible to the world. And yet, there was an unspoken tension that accompanied this newfound purpose. Every time I saw a photo of him flashing his perfect smile, I had to suppress the urge to scroll endlessly, to dive back into the archives of his online life, to examine every story, every post, every interaction for evidence that could be used strategically. It was addictive, thrilling, and terrifying all at once, but I couldn't stop myself. I wanted to see justice served in whatever form it was meant to take. Slowly, the narrative of my life and his started intertwining in my mind, not as a romanticized revenge fantasy, but as a careful observation of cause and effect. Every misstep, every arrogance-fueled decision he made became a data point in the story I was quietly crafting, a story that could one day tip the scales in ways he never anticipated. I began to understand that his fame was a fragile thing, a carefully constructed persona built on illusion, fear, and blind admiration. And that knowledge gave me a dangerous kind of hope. By the end of the year, I had developed a rhythm, days filled with work, friends, and my own personal growth, nights consumed with subtle investigation, observation, and planning. The fire from college had never gone out. It had simply been refined, waiting for the right opportunity to blaze in a way that was measured, precise, and inevitable. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control I had never known before, the thrilling realization that I wasn't just a passive observer in Carson's story anymore. I had become an active player in the game, ready to see how the carefully constructed world of my college bully could finally meet the consequences it deserved. And that realization, quiet yet electrifying, kept me awake for nights, heart racing, mind alive with possibilities. As I imagined the day when the facade would crack and the world would finally see the man behind the mask. By the time I turned 26, I realized I wasn't content just watching Carson stumble. I wanted the truth to be visible, undeniable, and in the open. A reckoning that reflected years of his arrogance and manipulation. And the more I observed him, the more obvious his vulnerabilities became, hidden behind the glossy veneer of curated images and viral videos. He had built this world of wealth, charm, and influence on carefully managed lies. Fake relationships staged for publicity, exaggerated travel adventures, philanthropy that only existed for the cameras, and professional partnerships that he'd sabotage when things weren't going his way. All of it a fragile tower of smoke that could collapse with the right spark. And I intended to be that spark without ever letting it seem like I was attacking him out of vengeance, because this was about justice, about exposing a truth people deserve to see. I started small, quietly collecting screenshots, tracking inconsistencies in his stories, noting every public misstep and contradiction, every detail that revealed the man behind the mask, how he claimed to donate thousands to charity while multiple people he had worked with privately complained about unpaid services, how he flaunted relationships that evaporated the moment cameras were off, how even his biggest followers occasionally left comments that hinted at suspicion but were ignored because the illusion was so strong. And every piece of evidence made my pulse quicken, with a combination of fear, thrill, and satisfaction. I reached out to people he had wronged professionally and personally, approaching them under the guise of casual networking, careful conversations that drew out details without raising alarms. And slowly, a web of corroboration began to form. A picture that no amount of filters or viral marketing could cover up. I learned to manipulate situations subtly, arranging social media interactions in ways that highlighted his lies without overt confrontation, planting truths in plain sight, letting others see them first, so that by the time Carson noticed, the cracks were already spreading and there was no coming back. Watching him react in real time was intoxicating. The confident, untouchable persona began to falter in the smallest, most telling ways. A poorly timed story, a defensive response to a comment he would normally ignore, the way his followers' adoration wavered when confronted with minor contradictions, and I could feel the tension building across his curated life like a storm gathering on the horizon. It wasn't just the professional missteps that fueled this process either. I found pieces of his college behavior mirrored in his public interactions. The arrogance, the subtle need to dominate conversations, the way he manipulated others to maintain control. And every revelation became another thread in the tapestry of exposure I was weaving. As I balanced my own growing obsession with this project against my personal life, I realized I had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all backfire, making me look like a petty ex-classmate rather than someone shining a light on truth. It was a tightrope walk of morality, strategy, and emotional investment, where I had to constantly remind myself why I was doing this, grounding my actions in justice rather than revenge. And yet, at times, I couldn't help the rush of satisfaction when I saw him flinch under the weight of public scrutiny, even in small doses. Weeks turned into months, and the effect of my subtle interventions began to ripple outward. Carson's posts were increasingly defensive, his usual charm strained, the gloss on his life slightly dulled by inconsistencies pointed out by followers or reported by insiders who had grown tired of his manipulations. And it was mesmerizing to watch him try to regain control while everything he had built began to teeter. Friends and associates who had once seemed loyal quietly distanced themselves, and I could see the cracks widen as his ego, always his greatest asset, became the very thing that threatened to topple him. I found myself balancing exhilaration with self-restraint, documenting every reaction, every public slip, knowing that a single wrong display of emotion could ruin my own credibility if I wasn't careful. And yet the satisfaction of seeing someone who had tormented me for years finally face a mirror to his own flaws was almost overwhelming. At the same time, I began to notice the psychological impact this process had on me. How much I relished seeing the truth emerge, how careful I became not to cross the line into cruelty, and how my own confidence, forged in the fires of years of personal growth, had become an instrument of strategy rather than impulse. I reached a critical point when a former collaborator of Carson's, someone I had befriended under the guise of casual connection, shared a document detailing mismanaged funds, promises broken, and unethical behavior that had been quietly covered up. And reading through it, I realized this was the tangible proof I had been seeking. Evidence that could not be brushed aside, manipulated, or ignored, and with it, the potential to bring the illusion crashing down in a way that was undeniable and morally justified. I began to craft a plan for how to release the information subtly, ensuring that it spread organically through the channels where his influence had previously thrived. And as the first hints of exposure began to surface online, I watched, heart pounding, as Carson's composure faltered in public, his usual smirk replaced by tension, defensiveness, and frustration, a visible unraveling that was both thrilling and nerve-wracking, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of vindication, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning, that the full impact of his lies and manipulations had yet to be realized. It was during this time that I reflected on the lessons I had learned since college: patience, observation, and the value of subtlety over brute confrontation. I had grown in ways I hadn't imagined possible, and now I had the opportunity to put that growth to use in a way that was satisfying, not because it was revenge, but because it was truth meeting consequence. And the moral clarity of that purpose made each step feel justified. The tension built as social media reactions started amplifying, journalists picked up on rumors that had long circulated quietly, and former associates began to speak publicly, all while Carson scrambled to maintain the persona he had carefully cultivated for years. And it was a masterclass in the fragility of a life built entirely on image. I began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior: forced smiles during interviews, hastily deleted posts, vague explanations to fans, all signs that the carefully crafted machine he had built was beginning to sputter. And with each moment, the thrill of witnessing the truth rise to the surface became intoxicating. And through it all, I reminded myself why I had started this journey. Not for cruelty, not for petty satisfaction, but for justice, for the balance that had eluded him for so long, and for the quiet closure that I had been denied as a college student. By the end of the year, The momentum I had built was undeniable. Carson's public image was cracking, cracks turning into fissures, and I watched with a strange mixture of detachment and satisfaction as the man who had once made my life miserable struggled to maintain the illusion of control. While I, the timid girl from college, now 26 and wiser, watched silently far from the sidelines, ready to see karma in motion and ready to take the final steps to ensure that when the dust settled, truth, not arrogance, would prevail. By the time I turned 27, the careful, patient work I had put into observing, documenting, and subtly exposing Carson's flaws had reached its inevitable climax. And I watched from a distance as the carefully constructed facade he had spent years building began to crumble, in ways I could have never imagined when I was a timid, humiliated girl at 18. Because there's a distinct kind of satisfaction in seeing someone who thrived on manipulating the world around them finally confronted with the reality they spent so long avoiding. And Carson's fall was both swift and brutal, not because I had hurled insult or staged dramatic confrontations, but because the world had caught up to the lies, manipulations, and arrogance he had wrapped in charisma, and suddenly every follower, every fan, every so-called friend who had admired him blindly, was faced with the truth in stark, undeniable ways. Videos he had doctored or exposed, screenshots of private messages revealing selfishness, deceit, and cruelty went viral. Journalists reported on failed business ventures, and people he had harmed professionally and former collaborators came forward with testimonials that left no room for spin. All of it painting a picture of a man who had hidden behind charm and bravado for far too long. And as the news spread, I could see the cracks widen in the public persona that had tormented me for so long. The same confidence that had once allowed him to humiliate me and others now faltering under scrutiny. His online presence erratic, his responses defensive and desperate, his carefully polished image marred by every revelation that surfaced. And in the midst of it all, I felt a strange, almost surreal detachment, because I realized that I didn't need to participate in his downfall actively. Truth had a way of rising to the surface on its own, and my role had been to quietly observe and ensure that the light of reality reached him without my interference needing to be visible, and the realization that karma doesn't always require vengeance, just patience and persistence was deeply satisfying. I remember seeing him in a live-streamed interview where he stumbled through answers, his usual arrogance replaced by visible tension, his body language betraying the fear and frustration that had been carefully hidden from the world for years. And I felt a moment of vindication tempered by an understanding that cruelty wasn't necessary, that justice had its own rhythm, and that watching it unfold naturally was far more rewarding than I could have orchestrated. Alongside this, I noticed subtle reactions from people who had once cheered him on, from fans questioning past claims, from associates distancing themselves, from friends quietly acknowledging the truth. And I realized how thoroughly his life, built on manipulation, was being dismantled piece by piece. And in this dismantling, I also saw my own growth reflected back at me, because I had spent years learning how to move through life with confidence, intelligence, and moral clarity, and I could now stand unshaken, while the person who had caused me so much pain faced the consequences of their own making without needing to compromise my values or resort to cruelty. It was cathartic in a way that few experiences in life allow, the sort of emotional closure that isn't loud or dramatic but deeply satisfying, because it confirms not only that justice can prevail but also that resilience, patience, and integrity are powerful tools in the long game. And as I scrolled through the news reports, social media reactions, and viral exposés, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm mixed with triumph, knowing that the timid, anxious girl who had cowered in corners at 18 had transformed into a woman who could navigate the world with confidence, grace, and a quiet strength that demanded respect, not through force, but through presence and capability. There were moments when I paused, reflecting on how far I had come, the years of learning to trust myself, the boundaries I had set, the relationships I had cultivated with care and integrity, and I realized that my own rise was inseparable from the fall of someone who had once thrived on undermining me. Because growth often requires contrast, and seeing the consequences of unchecked arrogance reminded me of the importance of empathy, patience, and the courage to stand firm even when the odds feel stacked against you. I thought back to the dance floor, to the cafeteria spills, to the whispered jokes and public humiliation, and I understood that each of those moments, painful as they were, had forged the resilience and strategic mind that allowed me to navigate this process with poise, and that the emotional scars had in time become the fuel for a triumph that was both personal and moral, a demonstration that you can rise above cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. By the time Carson's public image had fully unraveled, his scandals documented and discussed in every corner of the internet, his carefully curated friendships severed or exposed as opportunistic, and his once dedicated followers questioning everything they had admired, I felt a sense of closure that was profound and peaceful, the kind that doesn't come with fanfare, but resonates internally, confirming that I had endured, learned, and emerged stronger, and that the power of patience, observation, and integrity could achieve far more than vengeance ever could. I walked through the streets of Boston one crisp morning, sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings, and felt a lightness in my chest. A freedom from years of carrying the weight of past humiliation because I had witnessed the natural unfolding of justice without compromising who I was. And in that moment, I truly understood the meaning of resilience and closure, the satisfaction of seeing truth meet consequence, and the joy of realizing that my own rise, grounded in patience, morality, and self-respect, was the ultimate triumph, far exceeding anything Carson's superficial fame could ever provide. And as I sipped my coffee by the window, watching the city awaken, I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the timid girl from 18 had become a woman who could face the world with confidence, who had reclaimed her narrative, and who had finally seen karma in its most elegant and inevitable form take its course, leaving me not only victorious but at peace, with the knowledge that life's balance, patience, and integrity are the most powerful forces of all. The end. I witnessed a crime that everyone tried to cover up. I never thought a Tuesday morning could completely upend my life, but there I was, sitting in my cramped, slightly messy apartment in Chicago, sipping my lukewarm coffee while scrolling through emails for the 10th time, trying to convince myself that nothing exciting ever happened in my life, that my 29-year-old existence as a mid-level software engineer was going to be comfortably boring forever. And honestly, I liked it that way. Quiet routines, minimal social interaction, predictable paycheck, the occasional weekend pizza binge and movie marathon. But the universe apparently disagreed, because by the time I left for work that morning, I had no idea I was about to witness something that would make my blood run cold and my brain scream at me to run, hide, and pray I lived to see another day. And it all started because of my curiosity, the kind that had always made me a slightly annoying but well-meaning guy, the kind that made me double-check street signs, ask too many questions at work, and occasionally poke my nose into things I probably shouldn't. I was walking to the office, earbuds in, listening to some mellow jazz, minding my own business, when I decided to take a slightly longer route through the industrial district just to clear my head. The street's quiet except for the occasional rumble of a delivery truck, and that's when I noticed the warehouse. A dilapidated, rust-streaked building with half-shuttered windows, a place I would have never given a second glance under normal circumstances. But today, something about the smell in the air, a sharp metallic tang that made my stomach twist, made me pause. Curiosity won. I wandered closer, and that's when I saw them. 3 men in black suits and gloves hunched over a dumpster behind the building, struggling to lift a huge black container, the kind you'd assume just held old office supplies. But what I saw them do next made my heart stop. They tipped it over, and a dark, viscous liquid spilled across the concrete, steam rising in little, angry curls. And I realized, horrified, it wasn't just some waste. It reeked of chemicals, almost like industrial-grade toxic sludge, and then one of them glanced up directly at me, eyes narrowing in a way that made my skin crawl, and in that split second, I knew they had noticed me, that I was no longer just a curious passerby, but a potential problem, a witness, and instinctively I ducked behind a stack of pallets, hard hammering, praying they hadn't memorized my face, praying my hoodie and the shadows would be enough, but of course, that only bought me a moment because when I peeked, they were scanning the area, one of them lifting a phone, probably calling someone, probably alerting a chain of people who didn't want anyone, knowing this was happening. I crouched lower, back against the cold metal, realizing how stupid I had been, how a simple morning stroll had put me in the middle of a nightmare I didn't sign up for. And then came the sound that made my stomach turn, the metallic clank of a lid being closed violently and footsteps heading my way, fast, purposeful. And I knew I had maybe seconds to get out or I'd be next, my lungs burning, my legs pumping as I ran down the alley, every shadow looking like a potential threat, every turn making me flinch, until finally I emerged onto a busier street, blending into the crowd, panting, shaking, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, but I hadn't because the smell still clung to my clothes. The image of those 3 men burned into my memory, and I knew, gut sinking, that whatever I had seen was dangerous, criminal, and if anyone found out I saw it, my life wouldn't just be inconvenient. It would be at serious risk. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I kept replaying it, feeling the cold sweat on my back, thinking about what kind of people could do that and who would protect them. And that's when the thought hit me like a sledgehammer. If the world didn't care to stop them, if everyone else turned their heads or got paid off or was too scared to act, then who would stop me from becoming the next problem they erased? And the realization hit harder than anything else I'd ever known. I was now a part of something much bigger than me, something terrifying, and my life, as mundane and predictable as it had been, was gone forever. I barely slept that night, and by morning my head was pounding from the cocktail of fear and adrenaline still coursing through my veins. but I convinced myself that doing the right thing would somehow calm me down, that maybe once I reported what I saw, I could get back to my life, pretend none of it happened. So I threw on the same gray hoodie from yesterday, grabbed a folder, and went straight to the police station, my palms slick with sweat as I replayed how to describe it without sounding insane. But the second I sat in that cold, fluorescent lit lobby and tried to explain to the officer behind the glass that I'd witnessed three men dumping what looked like toxic chemicals behind a warehouse, something shifted. The look he gave me wasn't concern or even curiosity, it was calculation. Like, he was silently weighing whether I was worth the trouble, and he cut me off halfway through my description with a bored, "We'll look into it, sir," before sliding a clipboard toward me and asking me to write it down for records. The kind of tone that screamed this was going straight into the trash. Still, I filled it out. Every detail I could remember. Names, times, even the faint logo I'd noticed on one of the men's jackets. A stylized silver A that I later realized was from Avalon Industries, one of Chicago's biggest chemical manufacturers, and, coincidentally, one of my company's biggest clients. And that realization hit me like a sucker punch because I knew how deep corporate ties ran in this city. And when I mentioned the company name to the officer, his demeanor changed completely, stiffening before muttering, "You sure about that?" in a tone that made it sound like a threat more than a question. By the time I left the station, I knew something was off. And when I checked later that afternoon, no official report had been filed, nothing in the system, like my visit had never happened, and that's when the paranoia started creeping in. This quiet, constant buzzing in the back of my mind that told me I just stepped into something I couldn't walk away from. The next day, I decided to go through internal channels, HR at work, specifically our compliance department, since Avalon Industries was one of our biggest accounts and we had shared projects, figuring if this was something that could harm the public, maybe my company would want to distance itself, maybe someone would care about integrity. But as soon as I brought it up in a meeting with my manager, Mark, his fake smile froze mid-sentence and he said something like, "Dan, you're not suggesting our client's involved in anything illegal, right?" And I could tell by his tone that this wasn't curiosity either. It was warning. Later that evening, I got called into HR where they politely told me to focus on my core responsibilities and not make speculative allegations about valued partners, which sounded suspiciously rehearsed, like they'd already been told to shut me down before I even walked in. And I remember walking out of that office with my heart in my throat, wondering how far this went, how many people already knew and decided silence was safer than honesty. That's when the isolation hit me hardest. People at work started avoiding me. Conversations went quiet when I walked into the break room. Even my closest colleague, Tara, who I used to grab coffee with every morning, stopped replying to my texts, and I began to wonder if I'd already been labeled as a liability, maybe even a threat. And yet, some stupid part of me still believed there had to be someone out there willing to listen. So I tried contacting a local journalist from the Chicago Observer named Melissa Hart, a reporter known for tackling corruption stories, and she seemed interested at first, even agreed to meet me for coffee. But the night before we were supposed to meet, she texted me a short message that made my stomach drop. "Sorry, Dan, can't pursue this story. Be careful who you talk to." I stared at that message for hours, the words blurring as 100 questions ran through my head. How did she know my name? How did she know I might be in danger? Who warned her off? That's when the fear began morphing into something darker, suspicion, and I decided to start keeping records of everything. Every interaction, every strange email, every unexplained phone call, all of it stored on an encrypted flash drive, hidden behind a loose brick in my apartment wall. I even started taking photos near the warehouse at night when I could muster the courage, though each time I went back, it looked more deserted, like they'd moved operations or scrubbed the place clean. And once I thought I saw the same black SUV parked near the corner, engine idling, headlights off, but when I turned to look again, it was gone. The following week, things escalated. I noticed weird things at work, like my ID badge not working one morning, my desk being moved for convenience, and IT calling me to update my system access, which I knew was just code for monitoring my devices. And when I tried logging into my private email from my phone, it was locked, password change, and that's when the realization hit me fully. I wasn't just ignored, I was being actively watched, managed, contained, and the more I tried to act normal, the more paranoid I became. Jumping at every sudden sound, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds during my drive home, and still, some part of me refused to stay quiet because I couldn't live with myself knowing I saw something terrible and just walked away. One evening, I went back to the police station, this time with printed photos of the warehouse and the containers, determined to make them listen. But when I got there, the same officer from before looked up at me and said, "Dan, we already looked into it. Nothing there." His tone was casual, but his eyes, they were cold, deliberate, and as he handed me back the photos, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The corner of one print had a faint smudge of ash, like someone had tried to burn it. I didn't even remember leaving those anywhere. I muttered something and left, trying to keep my breathing steady, but as soon as I got outside, my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number that simply read, "Stop digging, you're being watched." No punctuation, No signature, nothing else, and when I looked up from the screen, I could swear I saw a man leaning against a lamppost across the street, smoking, facing my direction, not moving, not blinking. And that's when the reality of it all finally hit me in full. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was real, and somehow, by trying to do the right thing, I had become the enemy in someone else's story. After that message, the world I thought I understood started crumbling, and I realized that if I was going to survive this, I couldn't trust anyone blindly, not even the people I thought were closest to me. And I tried, God, I tried to reach out. First to my best friend from college, Mike, the guy I'd known since freshman year, thinking he'd at least listen without judgment. But when I told him over coffee, his jaw tightened, his eyes darted to the door, and he whispered, Dan, maybe you should drop this. I don't want anything to happen to you or me. And it was the first time it really hit me that fear could be stronger than loyalty, that people I trusted could crumble under pressure. And then there was Tara, my coworker who had always seemed like an ally, and I thought maybe she'd help me figure out a legal way to report what I saw. But when I approached her in the break room and started explaining the situation, she froze, glancing around like she expected someone to jump out of the shadows, and she said, Dan, I don't think we should talk about this. Just stay quiet. And I realized her loyalty wasn't gone because she was a bad person. It was gone because survival instincts had kicked in, and I had to respect that, but it left me painfully alone, gnawing at my chest with a mixture of fear and frustration, wondering if anyone in this city could be trusted if they were all complicit in silence. And that's when I started digging deeper on my own, deciding I couldn't sit idly by, couldn't just watch this rot unfold without taking some action. So I spent nights poring over public records, corporate filings, even anonymized government documents, trying to find anything that connected Avalon Industries to illegal activity, trying to map out a pattern, anything that could help me make sense of the horror I'd witnessed. And it was during one of these late night sessions that I stumbled across a name. Evelyn Moore, a former corporate auditor turned whistleblower, known for taking on corruption in Chicago's corporate and political scene, and contacting her was a risk, I knew, but something told me she was the only person who could guide me through the labyrinth of deceit. And to my surprise, she responded cautiously, asking me to meet in a small, nondescript cafe on the north side, a place she said was quiet and secure. And when I walked in, she was exactly how the articles described, sharp-eyed, calculating, cautious, with a presence that made you feel like she had seen the worst of humanity and survived to tell the tale. And over black coffee that tasted bitter and burned slightly on the tongue, she leaned forward and said, Dan, you're already in deep, deeper than you realize. The people behind this won't stop, and if they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate. And that sentence made me swallow hard, heart hammering, because it confirmed the fear that had been lurking in the shadows since the first moment I saw those men dumping chemicals. That this wasn't just a small operation. It was a network, carefully hidden, protected by powerful people who had influence in government, law enforcement, and media, and Evelyn became my reluctant mentor, showing me how to document evidence safely, how to use encrypted channels, how to leave digital footprints that could mislead anyone trying to trace me. And for the first time in days, I felt a sliver of control amidst the chaos, though it was fragile and fleeting. Meanwhile, life continued on the surface. My day job, the mundane routines, the weekend grocery trips, the casual chats with coworkers who had no idea what was happening. Everything normal, masking the storm underneath, but the tension was constant. Every glance from a stranger, every unfamiliar car parked near my apartment made me flinch, and it wasn't paranoia anymore. It was survival mode, heightened, sharp, all-consuming, and I realized that even normal daily life could be weaponized against me if I wasn't careful. One night, I was returning from a late meeting with Evelyn, walking down a dimly lit street when a car slowed beside me, its windows tinted too dark, engine idling, and I froze, heart hammering, and instinct took over. I ducked behind a dumpster, pressed flat against the cold metal, praying they wouldn't notice, watching as the car idled for what felt like an eternity before peeling away, tires screeching softly against asphalt. And in that moment, I understood fully that the danger wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, immediate, and whoever was watching me knew how to play the game, knew when to threaten without revealing themselves fully. A tactic designed to destabilize me, to wear me down. Days blurred into nights, and I became obsessed with tracking the movements around the warehouse and surrounding industrial district, sneaking out at odd hours with a small camera, documenting license plates, suspicious deliveries, and people I had only seen in shadows, building a web of evidence in my tiny apartment, which became both a war room and a prison, my own sanity fraying as the walls seemed to close in. But I couldn't stop because every piece I gathered brought me closer to understanding the scope of the operation, and the more I uncovered, the more terrifying it became. Avalon Industries wasn't just dumping toxic waste illegally. They had connections to political figures, law enforcement officials, shell companies laundering money, and even local media outlets that reported selectively or ignored incidents entirely. And I realized the extent of the corruption went far beyond anything I could have imagined. That a single misstep on my part could trigger catastrophic consequences, not just for me, but for anyone I cared about. And yet the moral imperative kept gnawing at me, refusing to let me sleep, refusing to let me give up, because if no one exposed this, the damage would continue unchecked, poisoning rivers, neighborhoods, and lives while the people responsible laughed behind closed doors. And then came the turning point. A single, subtle hint that sent chills down my spine. While reviewing security footage from a nearby street camera I had managed to access through contacts Evelyn trusted, I noticed a familiar face, one of the men I saw at the warehouse, casually walking past a cafe I frequented, looking directly at the camera as if he knew it was watching. And it clicked. He had seen me, he knew I was tracking, and I understood in that instant that the operation wasn't just hidden, it was aware, adaptive, a living, breathing network of surveillance and control, and the realization struck me like a blow to the chest. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a target. And if I wasn't meticulous, if I wasn't careful, I wouldn't survive long enough to tell the story. And as I sank back into the chair in my apartment, staring at the maps, photos, and notes strewn across my desk, I felt a mix of fear and grim determination, knowing that to move forward, I had to accept the truth, trust no one, rely only on what I could verify, and prepare for the day when my evidence would either bring justice or make me disappear. Because the crime I had stumbled upon was far bigger, far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined, and the deeper I went, the more I realized that there was no turning back. I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling, like every choice I made carried consequences that I could barely anticipate, and it hit first at work, the one place I had counted on for stability. My manager, Mark, who used to casually ask about my weekend plans and make bad jokes about coffee, suddenly started sending curt emails questioning my performance. Small things at first, a missed spreadsheet, an overdue report, but then escalated to formal warnings and meetings with HR, where I had to defend myself against accusations of insubordination and disruptive behavior. And it was humiliating. Sitting in those stark conference rooms while people who barely knew me talked about my professionalism as if it were up for debate. And the irony stung because the very thing I was trying to do, stop wrongdoing, protect people, was being twisted into the story that I was the problem. And the humiliation wasn't confined to the office. It spilled into my personal life as well. Subtly at first, friends canceling plans, my phone going unanswered, even Tara, who had once been a source of comfort, avoiding my messages. And I began to realize that once you step into this kind of fight, isolation is inevitable because fear spreads faster than loyalty. And suddenly I was a man alone in a city that didn't care about the truth, only about protecting the powerful, and that isolation gnawed at me relentlessly, keeping me awake for nights on end, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the warehouse, the toxic sludge, the network of people who had so far evaded accountability, and wondering if I had made the right decision at all. Because every morning when I looked in the mirror, I saw the strain etched into my face, the dark circles under my eyes, the unshakable tension in my shoulders, and I knew that if I kept going, I might lose more than just my job. I might lose who I was entirely. But then came the moral reflection that refused to let me give in, the voice in my head whispering that silence was complicity, that turning away would make me as guilty as the people I despised, and that even if the cost was high, the choice was simple. I could live quietly, pretending ignorance, or I could stand up, knowing the stakes, and try to stop the rot no matter the personal price. And that's when I began noticing the harassment intensifying in ways I hadn't fully grasped before. Strange calls in the middle of the night, a shadow moving across the street outside my apartment, emails from anonymous addresses containing nothing but cryptic warnings like "back off" or "you're next." And at first I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was paranoia, that my stress was manifesting in real-world fears, but the incident that finally obliterated any doubt happened one evening as I was leaving the small cafe where I'd met Evelyn, the whistleblower mentor who had become my lifeline. And I noticed a black sedan slowly following me, engine quiet, windows dark, and as I walked faster, it followed, and when I broke into a jog, tires squealed behind me. And in that instant, I knew this wasn't chance. It was intentional, and my adrenaline spiked, heart hammering in my chest as I darted into an alley, hiding behind trash bins, praying they didn't see me, praying they weren't willing to escalate further, and that night I returned home shaking, mind racing, finally acknowledging that this wasn't just about the chemicals, the corruption, or the cover-up, it was about my survival and the survival of anyone who dared to speak out. And the reality was brutal. By doing the right thing, I had painted a target on my back, and anyone I cared about could be at risk too. Friends, family, even strangers I interacted with casually could be threatened to keep me silent. And the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me, heavy and unrelenting, leaving me with sleepless nights and empty stomachs, and yet, somewhere beneath the fear, there was a spark, a stubborn ember of resolve that refused to die, and it showed when, a few days later, someone I knew from work, an innocent bystander caught in this mess, my coworker Tara, received a strange package at her apartment, nothing overtly threatening but enough to terrify her, a simple envelope with a few photos and a typed note. "He's digging too deep." And when she called me, Voice shaking, I could hear the panic and confusion, and I had to choose instantly between keeping quiet for my own safety or taking action to protect her. And I chose action. Driving across the city in a rainstorm, slipping through streets like a shadow and making sure she was okay, calming her down, while knowing full well that anyone watching knew exactly where I was. And it was the first time I truly understood what moral courage demanded. Not abstract heroism, not idealistic thoughts, but messy, dangerous, and personal intervention that risked everything. And as I sat with her, listening to her tremble and watching the flickering shadows of headlights across her living room walls, I realized that doing the right thing wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about staring fear in the face and still choosing to act, even if it hurt, even if it cost you everything. And that moment crystallized something fundamental in me. Silence was not an option, not anymore, because the price of silence was complicity, the kind that could poison lives, destroy neighborhoods, and erode the very idea of accountability. And so, despite exhaustion, despite the gnawing fear in my gut, despite the knowledge that I had made enemies capable of unimaginable things, I returned to my apartment that night and sat alone in the dark, documenting everything, reviewing photos, writing down every name, every vehicle, every suspicious interaction, heart pounding, hands trembling, knowing that the fight ahead would be long, dangerous, and unforgiving, but also knowing that I couldn't turn back, couldn't surrender to the fear because the alternative, doing nothing, was far worse. And as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the windows, I made a promise to myself that no matter what came next, no matter how high the personal cost, I would see this through because the truth was worth it. And I finally felt that ember of stubborn resolve flare into a fire that wouldn't be extinguished, a fire that would carry me forward into the chaos, danger, and moral complexity that awaited me. A fire that whispered with terrifying clarity, "Do not stop, do not yield, or everything you care about will burn." The weeks that followed felt like living inside a pressure cooker. Every second stretched tight with fear and adrenaline, and by the time I really dug into the investigation, I was running on a few hours of sleep a night, fueled by coffee, paranoia, and sheer determination, because I knew that whoever was behind this was not just watching. They were adaptive, calculating, always one step ahead, and I had to learn to move like a shadow, blending in during daylight, disappearing into the night, taking routes that didn't make sense on any GPS, and keeping my devices isolated from anything that could be traced, which meant hours of learning, experimenting, and sometimes failing miserably. Like the night I tried to capture the license plates of the trucks that hauled containers in and out of the warehouse, only to have a black SUV appear out of nowhere and follow me for nearly 10 minutes, engine silent, tinted windows reflecting streetlights, forcing me to duck into a parking garage and sit in a corner for nearly an hour before I dared move again. Heart hammering, thinking maybe this was it. Maybe this was how it ended, and yet the stakes forced me to keep going. So I started leaking small pieces of information online. Anonymous posts on forums and encrypted channels, nothing traceable back to me, just small hints that someone was paying attention, someone might be watching, testing the waters to see if anyone would respond. And it was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, because every click, every reply felt like the line between safety and discovery could snap at any moment. And slowly I began piecing together a pattern, connecting names, companies, even political figures to Avalon Industries and the toxic waste operation. But just when I thought I could breathe, I discovered cracks among the people I thought were allies. Evelyn, my mentor, was withholding some information, vague about certain financial transfers and suspicious accounts, and I realized that even she had reasons to be careful, that loyalty came with limits, that everyone had agendas, and that I couldn't let trust blind me, not when my life was literally on the line. The tension escalated when I noticed anomalies in my digital life. Encrypted emails I had sent to myself flagged as read before I even opened them. Strange pings from networks I didn't recognize. And my apartment felt like it had eyes. The shadows stretching differently at night, sounds just slightly off. And I had to remind myself constantly to stay calm, to stay focused, because if fear took over, I would make mistakes that could be fatal. And yet that fear sharpened me, made me notice details I'd previously missed. The frequency of certain truck movements, the timing of employee arrivals, the seemingly innocuous deliveries that were anything but. And then came the night I found the video clip, hidden deep in a shared drive I hacked with guidance from Evelyn, footage of a high-ranking executive at Avalon personally overseeing the dumping, laughing as workers poured toxic sludge into containers, and then signaling to a man I later identified as a city official, who nodded and walked away, like everything was perfectly normal, like they were untouchable. And as I watched, my stomach churned, because this was concrete evidence, proof that implicated not just one company or a couple of workers, but an entire web of corruption reaching into government, enforcement, and finance. And I knew instantly that this could be the breakthrough I needed, the kind of evidence that could topple people far beyond my imagining. But with that realization came the crushing weight of responsibility, because now, if I moved wrong, if I made a misstep, they would know I had the footage and that would make me their immediate target. I began planning meticulously, encrypting copies of the video across multiple hidden drives, backing up metadata, even photographing the raw drives and hiding them in inconspicuous places. A web of contingency plans forming in my mind. And I started running simulations in my head of what would happen if someone tried to trace me, testing escape routes, safe houses, even reconsidering the people I had previously leaned on, knowing that betrayal could come from any corner, that some of the contacts I'd made in the journalist community might not be completely clean, that they might have been compromised, and that paranoia became a necessary tool, a lens through which I filtered every interaction. And yet, even as the danger multiplied, I couldn't stop, because the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. I could see the scale of the operation, how money flowed, who benefited, who covered up, and who enforced the silence. And it was bigger, infinitely bigger than I had feared, extending beyond the warehouse, beyond the city to networks that could bury anyone. And I had to find a way to expose it without losing myself, without losing my life, because I now had enough to bring down key players, enough to force accountability, but the question was how, when, and at what personal cost. And in the midst of all this, I realized something profound. In this game of cat and mouse, the mouse could survive only by thinking 2 steps ahead, by anticipating moves, by staying invisible and unpredictable, and I started feeling the thrill of that dangerous dance, heart pounding every time I slipped past surveillance, every time I outmaneuvered a tail, knowing that the smallest mistake could be fatal, yet unable to stop, because now I was too deep, too invested, and the truth was too big to ignore. And as I sat in my apartment one night, surrounded by notes, screenshots, and maps, the city humming faintly beyond my window, I finally allowed myself a cold, grim smile. I had found the evidence that could bring them down. I had mapped their network, and I knew they knew I was watching, but I also knew I was no longer just reacting. I was planning, preparing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a dangerous exhilaration. Because despite the fear, despite the threats, despite the paranoia that clawed at my mind, I had control. And for a brief, terrifying, brilliant moment, I knew I could win this game, but only if I stayed one step ahead, only if I remained invisible, only if I embraced the role of predator and prey simultaneously. And that realization, terrifying as it was, made me more focused, more ruthless, and more determined than ever, because the stakes were now clear. This was no longer just about witnessing our crime. It was about exposing an entire network of corruption, survival, and justice, and I was the only one capable of doing it. Every decision I made felt like a tightrope walk over a canyon, every misstep threatening to plunge me into chaos. And the reality of being a whistleblower wasn't some abstract hero fantasy. It was a grind of sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and moral calculations that made my brain ache, because I now had evidence that could bring down people with influence, money, and power enough to ruin my life, or end it. And yet, despite the danger, I felt a responsibility gnawing at me, a relentless voice whispering that if I stayed silent, countless people would continue to be harmed, businesses would continue illegal operations, and the rot would spread unchecked. So I started meticulously planning how to release what I had without becoming the next headline of a disappearance or accident, weighing every platform, every channel, every method of anonymous exposure, from encrypted journalism networks to independent investigative reporters, all while running simulations in my head of how the perpetrators might react, what they could trace, and how they might retaliate against me or anyone close to me. And that was when the moral dilemmas hit hardest, because each option carried risk, not just to me, but to my family, friends, even innocent bystanders who might be linked to me tangentially, like Tara, who had already been spooked once, or my parents, blissfully unaware and perfectly vulnerable if anyone decided to make an example. And I found myself asking over and over if saving the public from harm was worth placing people I cared about in the crosshairs of ruthless, calculated criminals. And the question of timing became an obsession, because I knew too early a leak could be intercepted and destroyed. Too late could mean someone else suffered unnecessarily. And I also realized that confronting the perpetrators directly, the executives and officials who had orchestrated the toxic dumping, could be a trap, a way to flush me out and eliminate the threat entirely. Yet there was a part of me, stubborn, angry, moral, that wanted them to see that someone knew, that they couldn't hide, that even if it was dangerous, facing them could shake the foundation of their arrogance and maybe buy time to distribute the evidence safely. And I weighed each risk against the other, running endless checklists in my head, considering encrypted drives, burner phones, dead drop networks, and secure meeting points with journalists, trying to cover every angle and potential blind spot, every possibility that someone was watching, that my digital footprint could betray me, that I might be followed, and every scenario increased the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I spent hours with Evelyn, plotting, consulting, and testing theories, sometimes disagreeing with her, sometimes questioning her motives, because even allies had their own agendas, and the constant mental chess left me exhausted but sharp, because in this game, hesitation could kill you, and precision was everything. And as I reviewed the documents, video footage, financial transactions, and metadata one more time, I realized something critical. The scope of the operation was far larger than I'd initially estimated, spanning multiple states with shell companies, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement tied together in a network designed to withstand scrutiny. And the deeper I looked, the more apparent it became that a direct confrontation without the proper setup would be suicide. But so would hesitation, because the longer the evidence remained hidden, the more damage would be done to communities, rivers, and innocent lives exposed to toxic chemicals, illegal dumping, and financial exploitation. And every moment I delayed, my conscience screamed at me. Then came the sleepless night where I finally decided. I had to act, and not cautiously, not tentatively, but decisively, because the risk of inaction had become intolerable, and I had spent days planning contingencies, encrypted drives hidden in multiple locations, emergency contacts instructed on protocols, alternate identities ready, and a digital map of who could receive the leak first to maximize impact while minimizing immediate danger to those I cared about. And with a trembling hand, I triggered the first step, sending a package of evidence to a trusted journalist through an anonymized channel, including videos, emails, and financial records, knowing it was traceable to me only in ways I had covered, but aware that someone could still try. And as the confirmation pinged back that it had been received, I felt a surge of adrenaline and terror unlike anything I'd known. Because this wasn't hypothetical anymore. I had crossed the point of no return and there was no way back. The perpetrators would know, the pressure would escalate, and retaliation was inevitable, and I spent the rest of the night reviewing escape routes, safe locations, and possible scenarios, heart racing, mind calculating. But beneath the fear, I felt an odd, grim satisfaction, because the first move had been made. The whistleblower's gambit was in play. And whether it succeeded or failed, I had chosen to act, to place truth above my own safety, to commit to a path that could topple powerful people, but also potentially destroy my life. And that decision, terrifying and exhilarating, left me staring at the ceiling hours before dawn, hands trembling, heart pounding, knowing that the game had escalated, that I had lit a fuse, and that the next moves, whether by me or by those who wanted to silence me, would change everything forever. The fallout hit like a thunderclap, and suddenly the city I thought I knew felt like a war zone. Only this one was fought with information, fear, and the invisible hands of people who had everything to lose and nothing to hold back. Because within hours of my first leak reaching the journalist, the story exploded across independent media outlets, encrypted forums, and eventually mainstream news, with headlines screaming about corporate corruption, illegal toxic dumping, and high-level collusion. And for a moment, I thought maybe relief would come. Maybe the truth would protect me. But I was naive. Because the moment the light shone on the operation, it shone on me too. And I started noticing it immediately. Cars I didn't recognize parked near my apartment, shadows moving just beyond the edge of streetlights, emails from anonymous accounts filled with threats thinly veiled in legal jargon. And suddenly, the abstract fear of being targeted became tangible, physical, pressing against my chest with every heartbeat. And the media frenzy only made it worse, because every mention of the scandal included snippets of my identity, carefully anonymized, but enough to make me realize I was now a symbol, a target, and a lightning rod for anger, envy, and vengeance. And while some people hailed me as a hero, tweeting and posting about the brave whistleblower exposing evil, others vilified me, calling me a traitor, a liar, a reckless instigator who had put innocent lives in jeopardy. And the sheer volume of praise and condemnation was overwhelming. A storm of voices that battered my mind as much as the tangible threats outside, leaving me sleepless and jittery, watching every movement, counting every passerby, every car with tinted windows, every glance that lingered too long. And it wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was survival, a constant calculation of risk, because the perpetrators were far from passive, and I could see their retaliation starting in subtle but insidious ways. Smear campaigns, anonymous lawsuits, fake complaints to my landlord about noise and behavior, attempts to isolate me socially, and even mysterious service interruptions, like my internet cutting out at critical moments, my phone lines dropping calls as if someone was testing how far they could reach into my life without tipping their hand. And yet, amidst the fear, there was an almost perverse satisfaction, a grim moral satisfaction, because the evidence I had released was real, undeniable, and people were finally seeing the scope of what I had uncovered. The abuse of power, the environmental destruction, the web of corruption that stretched from corporate boardroom to city offices. And despite the chaos, I knew I had done the right thing, even if the cost was almost unbearable, even if I was being painted as a villain in some eyes, because justice is never clean, never simple, never satisfying in neat packages. And as the days passed, I watched the legal machinery grind slowly into motion. Investigations launched, executives subpoenaed, lawyers scrambling, but also loopholes exploited, bribes whispered about, pressure applied to journalists and witnesses. And I realized that this fight wasn't going to be neat or final, that the scales of justice were messy and incomplete. And no matter how much evidence I had, it would take time. And someone dangerous, would try to make me disappear before that happened. Then came the day that changed everything, the moment where theory collided with reality in the most visceral way. I was walking home from a late night grocery run, hoodie up, backpack tight against my chest, when I noticed the same black SUV I had seen months ago, slowing at the corner. Engine silent, tinted windows reflecting streetlights like dark mirrors. An instinct screamed at me to duck, hide, move, but I was caught mid-thought, and suddenly the passenger door swung open. A figure stepped out, tall, bulky, face obscured by a hood, and I recognized the movement, the way the body shifted, the slow, predatory approach. And my stomach dropped, heart hammering like it was going to burst, because I realized I was staring at a life or death moment, and every decision from that point was instantaneous. Do I run blindly into the streets, risking exposure? Do I try to negotiate, or do I fight, knowing the odds were against me? And before I could process fully, my hand instinctively reached into my jacket pocket, touching the small self-defense device I had hidden there, and the man froze, noticing the movement. And in that split second, I realized the stakes, realized that the betrayal that had been lurking in the background might have been closer than I imagined, because someone had tipped them off, someone who knew exactly when and where I would be, and that meant that even my allies could be compromised. That trust was still a fragile illusion, and as the figure advanced slowly, I calculated, pivoted, and dashed toward the shadowed alley I had memorized, dodging into darkness, feeling the rush of air and adrenaline, hearing heavy footsteps behind me, and in the chaos of that sprint, heart racing, lungs burning, I realized the brutal reality of whistleblowing. Every victory comes at a cost. Every exposure comes with enemies, and even when the public cheers, there are unseen consequences, hidden threats, and betrayals waiting in the shadows. And as I dove behind a dumpster, gasping for breath, watching the silhouette hesitate before retreating into the night, I understood with crystalline clarity that the fight was far from over, that the network of corruption was adaptive, dangerous, and willing to go to terrifying lengths to protect itself, but also that I had survived, that my evidence was out, that the truth had begun its slow, messy work. And despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, despite the knowledge that every step forward could be met with deadly retaliation, I felt the resolve harden in me, because I had chosen the path of accountability, had committed fully to exposing the rot, and whatever came next, whatever final betrayals or deadly confrontations awaited me, I was ready to meet it head on, because the only alternative was silence, complicity, and a life spent haunted by what I had refused to do, and I would never let that happen. I felt like I had been running not just through the streets of Chicago, but through the corridors of my own mind, a place twisted by fear, moral calculation, adrenaline, and exhaustion, because surviving the months of investigation, leaks, threats, and betrayals had left me frayed, paranoid, and hyper-aware of every shadow, every unfamiliar face, every car idling too long at intersections. And yet I couldn't stop, couldn't retreat, because the truth, the evidence I had gathered, the videos, documents, and insider accounts, had to see the light of day, had to reach someone, anyone, who could hold the perpetrators accountable. And I had learned in brutal, unforgiving ways that justice is never neat, never immediate, and never guaranteed. Only that the fight for it can cost everything you hold dear. And I felt that cost acutely as I prepared for what I knew could be the final phase of this ordeal, spending days relocating drives, encrypting every file in multiple layers, and mapping escape routes across the city in case someone traced me down. And it was during one of these late-night maneuvers that the culmination of all my fears and planning collided in real time. I had arranged to meet a trusted journalist contact at a remote location, a warehouse on the outskirts that was abandoned except for the sound of my boots echoing across the concrete. And as I entered the building, I sensed it immediately. The wrongness of it, the smell of metal and dust mixed with tension, and a shadow shifted in the corner. A figure I recognized instantly as one of the men who had been tailing me for weeks. His presence both confirmation of my fears and a trigger that sent my fight or flight instincts into overdrive. And I ducked instinctively behind a stack of crates, heart hammering, lungs burning, aware that if I were caught, this could be the end. That the careful web of evidence I had built could vanish in seconds. And as he advanced cautiously, I realized that my meticulous planning had to meet improvisation, that survival was now about thinking 10 steps ahead in milliseconds, and I triggered a distraction, knocking over a metal pipe to clatter across the floor, and the man froze, distracted just enough for me to slip into a side exit. Sprinting down the alley, rain-slick streets reflecting neon signs and the flash of headlights behind me, and I could hear the engine start. tires squealing on asphalt as he chased, but I had memorized every twist, every turn of these streets, every shadowed doorway. And I used that knowledge, ducking into a service entrance, clambering over chain link fences, even briefly hiding in a dumpster, to catch my breath, each heartbeat pounding like a drum in my chest, knowing that this was the moment my life could end, but also knowing I had come too far to surrender. And eventually, through a combination of instinct, preparation, and luck, I managed to lose him, slipping into a side street where the city seemed unaware of the chaos I had just survived. And for a moment, gasping, soaked, trembling, I realized I had escaped. Barely. And the relief was almost overwhelming, but fleeting, because the truth still needed exposure. And I had learned that survival and morality were not separate. They were intertwined, because to continue the fight, I had to endure, to be smart, to keep moving, and I had to accept that the consequences were permanent. In the days that followed, the fallout intensified. Some of the perpetrators were arrested or forced to resign. Investigations widened across multiple states, and public awareness surged. But it was messy, incomplete, and often unsatisfying, because while a few people faced accountability, others remained untouched, slipping through legal loopholes or disappearing behind layers of influence, and the media coverage was relentless, dissecting every detail of my life, painting me as hero, vigilante, or reckless whistleblower, depending on the outlet, while I navigated the tension of being celebrated and vilified at the same time, and personal costs mounted. I had lost jobs, friends had distanced themselves out of fear, and the relationship I had clung to for stability had fractured irreparably, leaving me alone in small apartments with little more than my evidence, my conscience, and the knowledge that I had done the right thing. Despite the scars and sleepless nights, and the psychological toll was heavy, I replayed every moment, every decision, questioning whether I had acted correctly, whether anyone had been inadvertently harmed, wondering if the people I protected were truly safe, and grappling constantly with the weight of moral responsibility, because being the one to act on knowledge of wrongdoing is not glamorous. It is exhausting, terrifying, and lonely, a constant negotiation between fear and courage, selfishness and integrity, survival and justice. Yet, despite it all, there was a grim satisfaction. An understanding that my actions had exposed a network that had thrived on secrecy and fear, that lives had been saved from ongoing environmental and financial harm, and that even if the victory was partial, messy, and incomplete, it was meaningful because someone had to step forward, someone had to take the risk, and someone had to bear the cost. And I had done that no matter how heavy the price, no matter how permanent the consequences. And as I sat in my apartment one rainy evening, watching the reflections of city lights ripple across the wet streets, I allowed myself a long, deep breath, feeling the exhaustion in my bones and the ache in my soul, and reflected on everything. The fear, the danger, the betrayals, the moral dilemmas, the fleeting triumphs, the losses. And I realized that courage is not about feeling unafraid, but acting despite the fear, that integrity is not rewarded neatly, that justice is rarely perfect, and that doing the right thing can leave you scarred, isolated, and haunted for years. And yet, even knowing all this, I would choose the same path again, because the cost of truth is always high, but the cost of silence is higher, and the lingering unease, the knowledge that the people I fought against are still out there, still powerful, still capable of harm, ensured that I would never feel completely safe, never completely at ease. A reminder that the fight for truth is never truly over, and that survival, morality, and courage are intertwined in ways that leave no one untouched, marking the end of this chapter of my life, not with resolution or neat closure, but with the weight of reality, the burden of responsibility, and a cautious, enduring hope that exposing the truth, even partially, had made the world slightly better than I found it, even if the scars would remain forever. The end.